The silence was absolute, that peculiar mountain quiet that seems to swallow sound before it can form. When the first scream shattered the darkness of Glacier National Park. It was a human voice, high and desperate, cutting through the crisp September air like a blade through silk, reverberating off the ancient granite walls in echoes that seemed to fracture and multiply before dying away into the vast emptiness of the Continental Divide. Then silence again, deeper now, pregnant with the weight of something terrible having just occurred, the kind of silence that follows catastrophe and makes even the wind hold its breath. Miles away, helicopter pilot Thomas Anderson, making an early morning supply run to a remote research station near Mount Cleveland, would later report hearing what he described as the kind of scream that changes you, that gets into your bones and stays there, echoing off the granite walls of peaks, whose Blackfeet names most people couldn't pronounce, but whose presence commanded respect from anyone who dared venture into their shadows. The sound reached him across valleys carved by glaciers millions of years in the making, carried on air so thin and clear it seemed to magnify every whisper while drowning out the thunderous roar of his helicopter's rotors. But in that moment, at precisely 2:47 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, according to multiple synchronized devices that would later serve as crucial timeline evidence, there was only the scream and then the silence, and somewhere in the darkness between the two, a story that would challenge everything we think we know about survival, about fear, about the ancient contracts written in blood between predator and prey, and about the thin line that separates the civilized world from the ancient wildness that still lurks in the shadows of America's last frontier. The GPS coordinates would later show 48.65, 189 degrees north, 113,615 degrees west, a seemingly random point on the vast tapestry of Glacier National Park, but coordinates that would be burned into the memory of search and rescue teams, wildlife biologists, trauma specialists, and anyone who heard what happened on that crystalline September night when the temperature dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit and the first hard frost of autumn kissed the high meadows with silver death that would signal the end of the growing season and the beginning of nature's most desperate preparations for winter survival. These coordinates marked a location 8.7 miles from the nearest maintained road, 4.2 miles from the closest emergency shelter, and exactly 17 miles from the nearest hospital capable of treating major trauma. Distances that would prove crucial in the race between survival and catastrophe that was about to unfold. To understand how Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, 28 years old, a software developer from Portland, Oregon, with dreams of becoming a nature photographer and an inexplicable need to prove something to herself about courage and independence, came to be in that exact spot at that exact moment, screaming into darkness that seemed to swallow her voice whole, while something ancient and powerful and utterly indifferent to human suffering moved through the shadows just beyond the reach of her failing flashlight. We must go back 3 days earlier to a sunny Thursday morning in downtown Portland when she made the decision that would change her life forever and set in motion a chain of events that would test every assumption she had ever held about nature, wilderness, and her own capacity for survival under conditions that no amount of preparation could have adequately anticipated. Glacier National Park stretches across 1,583 square miles of northwestern Montana, a wilderness preserve that forms part of the world's first international peace park, along with Canada's Waterton Lakes National Park. The crown of the continent, as it's known to locals and Native American tribes who have called this region home for over 10,000 years, sits at the convergence of two major mountain ranges where the Rocky Mountains meet the Continental Divide. Here, ancient Precambrian rocks dating back 1.6 billion years thrust skyward in a geological violence that speaks to the raw power of tectonic forces. These mountains, carved and sculpted by massive glaciers during the last ice age, create a landscape so dramatic that it seems almost fictional to visitors experiencing it for the first time. The park lies roughly 90 miles north of Missoula, Montana's cultural hub, and 30 miles south of the Canadian border, accessible primarily through the spectacular Going to the Sun Road, an engineering marvel that winds 50 miles through the park's heart. The region's elevation ranges from 3,150 feet at the park's lowest point to 10,466 feet at Mount Cleveland's summit, creating distinct ecological zones that support an incredible diversity of life. The area where Sarah would eventually encounter her nightmare sits at approximately 4,200 feet elevation in what ecologists call the montane zone, characterized by dense forests of Douglas fir, western hemlock, and western red cedar. The landscape here was shaped by the Flathead Glacier, a massive river of ice that carved the valley during the Pleistocene epoch, leaving behind the characteristic U-shaped valley profile and the scattered erratics. Massive boulders deposited seemingly at random when the glacier finally retreated some 12,000 years ago. Indigenous peoples, primarily the Blackfeet, Salish, and Kootenai tribes, have hunted and gathered in these mountains for millennia, leaving behind a rich cultural heritage that includes more than 270 archaeological sites within the park boundaries. European exploration began in earnest in the 1850s when the Great Northern Railway surveyed routes through Marias Pass, leading to increased interest in the region's natural resources and eventual designation as a national park in 1910. September in Glacier. National Park represents the shoulder season, a time when the intense summer crowds have largely dispersed but winter's grip has not yet fully taken hold. Average daytime temperatures hover in the mid-60s, dropping precipitously after sunset to lows that can reach into the 20s, particularly at higher elevations. The year Sarah visited had been marked by an unusually dry summer, with precipitation levels nearly 40% below normal, creating conditions that wildlife biologists would later describe as stressful for the park's large mammal population. The lack of rainfall had reduced berry production, a critical food source for bears preparing for winter hibernation, forcing them to expand their foraging ranges and increasing the likelihood of human-wildlife encounters. Frost typically begins appearing in early September at elevations above 4,000 feet, signaling to animals the urgent need to accumulate fat reserves for the coming winter dormancy period. The day Sarah began her journey, high pressure dominated the regional weather pattern, creating crystalline blue skies and exceptional visibility that revealed mountain peaks more than 60 miles away. However, weather in the northern Rockies changes with notorious speed, and meteorologists were tracking a Pacific storm system that promised to bring the season's first significant snowfall to higher elevations within 72 hours. Wind patterns typically follow the valley orientations, creating predictable down-valley flows during evening hours, as cooler air descends from the peaks, a phenomenon that would play a crucial role in the events that followed. The dry conditions had also elevated fire danger to extreme levels throughout the region, prompting park officials to implement strict campfire restrictions and close several backcountry areas deemed too risky for public access. The forests where Sarah's story unfolds represent one of North America's most intact temperate ecosystems, a green cathedral of ancient trees whose canopy soars 150 feet above the valley floor. Dominant species include western red cedar, some specimens exceeding 500 years in age and reaching diameters of 8 feet, creating a mystical understory where shafts of sunlight filter through the overhead latticework like nature's own stained glass. Douglas fir, Montana's state tree, mingles with western hemlock and western larch, the latter species particularly striking in autumn when its needles turn golden before dropping, the only conifer in the region that sheds its foliage seasonally. The understory bursts with mountain ash, serviceberry, and huckleberry bushes, the latter producing the dark purple berries that constitute a vital food source for both black bears and grizzly bears during late summer and early fall. Ground cover includes a thick carpet of mosses, particularly the feather moss species that create cushiony walking surfaces in the deepest forest, along with devil's club, a spiny shrub that can grow 8 feet tall and whose large palmate leaves create an almost tropical appearance despite the northern latitude. Trailside meadows burst with wildflowers through midsummer, including Indian paintbrush, lupine, and bear grass, whose towering white flower spikes can reach 6 feet in height during peak blooming periods. The density of this vegetation creates a landscape where visibility beyond 20 feet becomes difficult in many areas, a factor that would prove crucial during Sarah's encounter. Recent studies by park botanists have documented over 1,100 vascular plant species within park boundaries, creating food webs of staggering complexity that support everything from microscopic soil organisms to massive predators weighing over 600 pounds. Wildlife in Glacier National Park reads like a who's who of North American megafauna, with species that have largely disappeared from other regions of the continental United States. The park supports healthy populations of mountain goats whose sure-footed navigation of seemingly impossible cliff faces never fails to astound visitors lucky enough to witness them. Bighorn sheep roam the higher elevations, their massive, curved horns serving as both weapons and symbols of the rugged persistence required to thrive in this harsh environment. Elk populations, having recovered dramatically since early 20th century conservation efforts, now number in the thousands, their bugling calls during autumn rutting season, adding a haunting soundtrack to crisp September evenings. Moose, the largest members of the deer family, inhabit marshy areas and lake shores, where they feed on aquatic vegetation and can often be observed completely submerging their massive heads to reach preferred food sources. White-tailed deer and mule deer share overlapping habitats, while mountain caribou, though much reduced in numbers, still occasionally migrate through the northern sections of the park. Predator species include gray wolves, recently re-established after decades of absence, whose pack dynamics and hunting strategies continue to fascinate researchers studying predator-prey relationships in intact ecosystems. Mountain lions, secretive and largely nocturnal, patrol territories that can encompass hundreds of square miles, their presence often detected only through tracks or the occasional trail camera photograph. The bears, however, command the most attention and respect from visitors and researchers alike. Glacier National Park supports one of the most robust grizzly bear populations in the lower 48 states, with current estimates suggesting between 250 and 300 individuals roaming the park's vast wilderness. These magnificent creatures, technically classified as a subspecies of brown bear known as Ursus arctos horribilis, can weigh up to 800 pounds for mature males, though females typically range between 200 and 400 pounds. Black bears, smaller but no less impressive, are actually more numerous, with populations estimated at over 600 individuals. Both species enter a state called hyperphagia during late summer and early fall, consuming up to 2,000 calories per day as they prepare for winter hibernation. Recent bear activity reports filed with park rangers during the week of Sarah's visit included multiple sightings of grizzly bears actively foraging in lower elevation areas, behavior that wildlife biologists attributed to the poor berry crop at higher elevations, forcing bears to expand their search areas. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with shoulder-length auburn hair that caught sunlight in a way that reminded her friends of autumn leaves, and green eyes that reflected her Irish heritage from her mother's side of the family. At 28, she had reached that particular moment in life when the uncertainties of her early 20s were crystallizing into more defined ambitions and self-awareness, though she would readily admit to still feeling like she was figuring things out as she went along. Born and raised in suburban Portland, Oregon, she had grown up in a middle-class household where outdoor recreation was valued but not obsessed over, family camping trips to places like Crater Lake and the Oregon coast providing her foundational wilderness experiences, but nothing that could be considered extreme or particularly challenging. Her father, Robert Morrison, worked as an electrical engineer for Nike's headquarters in Beaverton, while her mother, Patricia, taught 3rd grade at a local elementary school, creating a stable, if unremarkable, childhood environment that emphasized education, responsibility, and moderate adventure. Sarah excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and science, leading to her enrollment at Oregon State University, where she pursued a degree in computer science with a minor in environmental studies, the latter choice reflecting a growing interest in conservation issues that would eventually influence her career choices. During college, she participated in the outdoor recreation program, learning basic backpacking and camping skills during weekend trips to the Cascade Range, experiences that sparked a deeper appreciation for wilderness environments and solitude. After graduation, Sarah accepted a position with a Portland-based software company specializing in environmental monitoring systems, work that combined her technical skills with her environmental interests in ways that felt meaningful and engaging. Her responsibilities included developing data visualization tools for researchers tracking climate change impacts on forest ecosystems, work that often required her to interpret field data collected from remote monitoring stations throughout the Pacific Northwest. This professional connection to wilderness research deepened her appreciation for wild places and gradually increased her confidence in outdoor settings, leading to more ambitious solo hiking trips throughout Oregon and Washington. Her personal life followed a pattern common among educated young professionals in Portland, with a serious 3-year relationship ending amicably the previous spring when her boyfriend accepted a job offer in Austin, Texas, and they couldn't agree on how to handle the long-distance challenge. The breakup, while painful initially, had ultimately felt liberating, freeing her to pursue interests and adventures that relationship compromises had sometimes limited. She lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in southeast Portland's Hawthorne district, a neighborhood known for its eclectic mix of coffee shops, bookstores, and restaurants that created a vibrant, if occasionally overwhelming, social environment. Friends described Sarah as thoughtful and somewhat introverted, someone who recharged through solitary activities rather than large social gatherings, though she was perfectly comfortable in groups when the mood struck her. She possessed what her college roommate called quiet confidence, an ability to assess situations carefully before acting, combined with enough self-assurance to trust her own judgment even when others might disagree. Her hobbies included photography, particularly landscape photography that required her to seek out remote locations during optimal lighting conditions, and rock climbing at indoor gyms around Portland. Though she had never attempted serious outdoor climbing ventures, the decision to visit Glacier National Park emerged from a convergence of factors that included accumulated vacation time that her supervisor was pressuring her to use before the end of the fiscal year, a photography project focused on documenting climate change, impacts on wilderness ecosystems, and what her therapist might have described as a need to prove something to herself following her recent breakup. She had been researching potential destinations for several months, drawn to Glacier's reputation for pristine wilderness and abundant wildlife, though she had never before attempted a solo backpacking trip lasting more than 2 nights. The planning process began in earnest during July when Sarah started researching permit requirements, gear needs, and potential routes for a 4-day solo backpacking adventure in Glacier National Park. She spent hours studying topographical maps and reading trip reports on backpacking forums, eventually settling on a route that would take her through the Bowman Lake area, known for its spectacular scenery and relatively moderate difficulty level. The trail she chose promised mountain lakes, old-growth forests, and the possibility of wildlife sightings while avoiding the most technically challenging terrain that might overwhelm a solo backpacker with limited experience. Her gear preparation was meticulous, perhaps overly so, involving multiple visits to Portland's outdoor gear shops, where she consulted with employees about everything from sleeping bag temperature ratings to water filtration systems. She purchased a new tent specifically for the trip, a lightweight 2-person model that would provide extra space for gear storage while remaining manageable for solo setup in challenging conditions. Her pack, a 48-liter women-specific model, underwent multiple loading and adjustment sessions in her apartment as she refined her packing strategy and eliminated unnecessary items to minimize weight. The food planning proved particularly challenging for someone accustomed to car camping where weight and space limitations didn't apply, requiring her to research lightweight meal options and calculate caloric needs for sustained hiking over multiple days. She invested in a bear canister, the hard-sided container required in many areas of Glacier National Park for storing food and scented items safely away from curious wildlife. Though the salesperson's explanation of proper usage was brief and focused primarily on basic operation, rather than optimal placement strategies. Her first aid kit was comprehensive, including items recommended by online backcountry safety resources, though her actual first aid training was limited to a basic CPR certification maintained for work requirements. Physical preparation included increasing her weekend hiking distances throughout the summer, working up-to-day hikes of 12 to 15 miles with elevation gains exceeding 3,000 feet, efforts that left her feeling confident about her fitness level for the planned adventure. She also spent time practicing with her new gear in local parks, setting up and breaking down her tent until the process became routine, and testing her water filtration system and camp stove to ensure she understood their operation before venturing into the wilderness, where equipment failures could become serious problems. The week before her departure, Sarah consumed bear safety information with the intensity of someone studying for a crucial exam, reading everything from Park Service brochures to academic papers about bear behavior and attack prevention. She watched videos demonstrating proper bear spray usage, practicing with an expired canister in her backyard until she felt confident about accessing and deploying the device quickly under stress. However, like many backpackers, her understanding of bear behavior remained primarily theoretical, based on reading and watching rather than actual experience with bears in wild settings. Her route planning included detailed study of recent bear activity reports available on the park's website, though she didn't fully understand that such reports typically represented only a fraction of actual bear encounters, and that absence of recent reports didn't guarantee an area was free from bear activity. She registered for backcountry permits through the park's advanced reservation system, selecting campsites that appeared isolated enough to provide the solitude she craved while remaining accessible via established trails that wouldn't challenge her navigation skills beyond her comfort level. The drive from Portland to Glacier National Park took 2 days, with an overnight stop in Missoula, Montana, where Sarah stayed at a budget motel and ate dinner at a local restaurant where the conversation at neighboring tables invariably turned to hunting, fishing, and outdoor adventures that seemed both thrilling and intimidating to someone from the more urban Pacific Northwest. The landscape gradually changed from the lush green of Oregon and Washington to the drier, more open country of eastern Montana, where golden grasslands stretched toward distant mountains that seemed to float above the horizon like mirage. Her first glimpse of Glacier's peaks from Highway 2 created the kind of emotional response that people struggle to describe adequately, a sense of scale and beauty that photographs had failed to convey, and that made her understand why people became addicted to wilderness experiences. Check-in at the backcountry permit office involved a brief conversation with a ranger who reviewed her planned route, discussed current trail conditions, and emphasized bear safety protocols in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who delivered the same information dozens of times daily during peak season. The ranger, a weathered woman in her 50s whose name tag identified her as Ranger Martinez, spent approximately 10 minutes reviewing Sarah's permit and providing current information about trail conditions, water sources, and recent wildlife activity in the area where she planned to camp. The conversation included discussion of proper food storage techniques, the importance of making noise while hiking to avoid surprising bears, and appropriate responses to bear encounters ranging from distant sightings to close encounters requiring defensive actions. Ranger Martinez also mentioned recent grizzly bear sightings in the Bowman Lake area, including a large male that had been observed fishing for kokanee salmon in the lake's outlet stream, behavior that was normal for the season but worth knowing about for situational awareness. Sarah's first day on the trail began at 7:30 a.m. with crisp temperatures in the low 40s and clear skies that promised a spectacular day for hiking and photography. The trailhead parking area contained only 3 other vehicles, creating the sense of solitude she had hoped to experience during her wilderness adventure. Her pack felt heavier than during training hikes, weighted down with 4 days of food, extra clothing for changing weather conditions, and photography gear that she knew added unnecessary weight but couldn't bear to leave behind. The trail began with a gentle climb through dense forest dominated by massive western red cedars whose trunks required her to crane her neck to see their tops disappearing into the canopy overhead. Shafts of morning sunlight filtered through the forest in dramatic rays that created perfect conditions for the landscape photography that was one of her primary motivations for the trip. She stopped frequently during the first hour to capture images of dewdrops on spiderwebs, patterns of light and shadow on moss-covered logs, and distant mountain peaks visible through gaps in the forest canopy. Wildlife signs were abundant from the beginning, with fresh deer tracks in muddy spots along the trail and numerous piles of black bear scat that appeared recent based on their condition and the presence of berry seeds that indicated late summer feeding behavior. She encountered no actual animals during the morning hours, though bird activity was constant, with Steller's jays calling raucously from the treetops and numerous species of woodpeckers creating a percussion soundtrack that echoed through the forest. The first campsite, reached after approximately 6 miles of hiking, sat beside a small alpine lake whose crystal clear waters reflected the surrounding peaks in perfect mirror images that seemed almost too pristine to be real. Sarah spent the afternoon exploring the shoreline, photographing wildlife sign including fresh moose tracks in the muddy areas near the lake's outlet, and setting up her camp in a designated area that provided bear-resistant food storage facilities and an established fire ring. Her evening routine included preparing her first backcountry dinner using her new camp stove, a process that took longer than expected but ultimately produced a surprisingly satisfying meal of dehydrated pasta, with vegetables that tasted remarkably good after a day of hiking. As darkness fell, temperatures dropped rapidly, reminding her that September nights in the mountains could be genuinely cold even when daytime conditions were pleasant. She followed proper bear safety protocols by storing all food and scented items in the provided bear box, maintaining the recommended distance between her tent and cooking area, and keeping her campsite meticulously clean of any food scraps or spills that might attract wildlife. The night passed peacefully with only the normal sounds of wind in the trees, distant owl calls, and the occasional splash of fish jumping in the lake to break the profound silence that characterized true wilderness areas. She woke refreshed and excited for the second day's hiking, which would take her deeper into the park's interior toward the more remote campsite where her encounter with the grizzly bear would occur. Day 2 began with a spectacular sunrise that painted the surrounding peaks in shades of pink and gold that made Sarah grateful for her decision to pursue this adventure despite her initial nervousness about solo backpacking in grizzly bear country. The morning hiking proved more challenging than the previous day, with sustained climbs that tested her fitness level and required frequent rest stops to catch her breath and adjust her pack straps. However, the trail rewards were proportional to the effort, with increasingly spectacular views of glaciated peaks and alpine meadows that seemed to stretch endlessly toward distant horizons. She encountered her first bear sign of the trip during the late morning hours when the trail crossed a small stream where fresh grizzly bear tracks in the soft mud showed the distinctive long claws and large size that distinguished them from black bear tracks. The prints appeared fresh, possibly from the previous evening based on their sharp edges and lack of weathering, creating a mixture of excitement and apprehension that made her more attentive to her surroundings and more diligent about making noise while hiking. Lunch break beside a rushing creek provided an opportunity to refill her water bottles and rest her shoulders before tackling the final climb to her second night's campsite, located in a high alpine basin surrounded by peaks that rose directly from the valley floor in dramatic walls of granite and sedimentary rock. The afternoon hiking proved demanding, with switchbacks that seemed to continue indefinitely and elevation gain that left her breathing hard. Despite her summer conditioning efforts, the second campsite exceeded even her optimistic expectations, situated beside a small tarn whose deep blue waters reflected the surrounding cirque like a natural mirror, creating views that seemed almost too perfect to be real. She spent the late afternoon hours exploring the area, photographing alpine wildflowers that bloomed in impossible profusion despite the harsh growing conditions, and marveling at the complete absence of human-made sounds or sights that created a sense of solitude unlike anything she had previously experienced. Evening preparations followed the same careful routine as the previous night, with all food and scented items secured in the designated bear box, and her campsite maintained in pristine condition to avoid attracting wildlife attention. However, subtle changes in animal behavior that she didn't recognize as significant would later be identified by wildlife biologists as indicators of increased predator activity in the area. Bird activity seemed more subdued than normal, with fewer species represented and calling patterns that suggested heightened alertness. The usual evening chorus of small mammals that characterized healthy wilderness ecosystems was notably absent, replaced by an unusual quiet that could have served as a warning to more experienced wilderness travelers. The night brought colder temperatures than the previous evening, with frost covering her tent's rain fly by morning and ice forming around the edges of the small tarn where she had admired her reflection the evening before. She woke multiple times during the night, initially attributing her restlessness to excitement about reaching her planned destination the following day, though she would later wonder if some subconscious awareness of predator presence had influenced her sleep patterns. Dawn of the third day revealed a spectacular weather pattern with high clouds creating dramatic lighting conditions that would have provided exceptional photography opportunities under different circumstances, though Sarah's attention was increasingly focused on reaching her final campsite where she planned to spend 2 nights before beginning her return journey. The morning hiking proved easier than expected, following an established trail through mature forest where decades of foot traffic had created a clear pathway that required minimal navigation skills. She encountered fresh bear sign again during the mid-morning hours, including recently disturbed vegetation where a bear had been digging for roots or bulbs, and several trees showing fresh claw marks that appeared to have been made within the previous 24 hours based on the bright color of the exposed wood. These signs, while exciting from a wildlife viewing perspective, also served as reminders that she was traveling through habitat actively used by large predators that could pose serious threats to unprepared or unlucky hikers. The final approach to her destination campsite followed a faint user trail that branched off from the main hiking route, leading toward a remote area that saw relatively few visitors even during peak season due to its distance from major park attractions and the moderate technical difficulty required to reach it safely. The decreased trail maintenance was evident in the form of fallen logs requiring her to climb over or around, marshy areas where the path became indistinct, and navigation challenges that required careful attention to map and compass. Despite the relatively short distance involved, her chosen campsite occupied a small meadow beside a creek that provided both fresh water and the background sound of running water that many wilderness travelers find conducive to peaceful sleep, though this same sound would later mask approaching footsteps during the crucial early morning hours when the attack occurred. The site offered spectacular views of surrounding peaks while providing enough timber to shelter her tent from wind, creating conditions that seemed ideal for her planned 2-night stay. The afternoon of day 3 unfolded with perfect weather conditions and remarkable wildlife viewing opportunities that included a family of mountain goats observed through her binoculars on distant cliff faces and numerous bird species that provided excellent photography subjects during the optimal lighting hours before sunset. She spent considerable time exploring the immediate area around her campsite, discovering a hidden waterfall, approximately half a mile upstream, and several wildlife trails that showed regular use by deer, elk, and bears based on the variety of tracks visible in soft soil beside the creek. Her confidence level had increased significantly during the first 3 days of the trip, with successful navigation, proper gear function, and beautiful weather conditions creating a sense of wilderness competence that she had hoped to develop, but hadn't been certain she could achieve on her first solo backpacking adventure. The sense of accomplishment was particularly strong because she had overcome initial nervousness about bears and other perceived dangers through careful preparation and conservative decision-making rather than reckless bravado. Evening preparations followed her established routine with bear-resistant food storage and meticulous campsite maintenance, though she made a critical error that would prove decisive in the events that followed. Her bear canister, the hard-sided container designed to prevent bear access to food and scented items, was positioned approximately 40 feet from her tent, in compliance with park regulations but placed near the creek, where the sound of running water would mask any noises made by investigating wildlife. Additionally, the canister was not optimally positioned relative to prevailing wind patterns, allowing food odors to drift toward her sleeping area during the calm evening hours. The mistake occurred during her dinner preparation when she accidentally spilled a small amount of freeze-dried pasta sauce on the ground near her tent, an error that she attempted to clean up but couldn't completely eliminate due to the liquid's penetration into the organic soil layer. Park regulations and bear safety protocols require backpackers to cook and eat at least 100 yards from sleeping areas specifically to prevent food odors from contaminating tent sites. But many solo backpackers violate this requirement due to convenience factors and perceived low risk levels. Additionally, Sarah had been using scented toiletries including soap, toothpaste, and deodorant, items that bear safety experts recommend storing in bear canisters along with food due to their strong odors and potential attractiveness to curious bears. While she had stored most of these items properly, she kept a small tube of toothpaste in her tent for convenience during nighttime bathroom trips, another minor violation of optimal bear safety protocols that would contribute to the approaching disaster. Her sleep that night was interrupted multiple times by sounds that she attributed to wind in the trees or small animals moving through the forest, though wildlife biologists would later suggest that these disturbances likely indicated the presence of large predators investigating her campsite and testing for opportunities to access food sources. Bear behavior studies indicate that both black bears and grizzly bears often spend considerable time observing human campsites before making direct approaches, gathering information about potential threats and food accessibility through careful stalking behavior. At approximately 11 p.m., Sarah was awakened by a distinctive sound that she couldn't immediately identify, but that seemed unnaturally loud and close to her tent, creating a spike of adrenaline that left her fully alert and straining to interpret sounds in the darkness beyond her thin nylon walls. The noise repeated several times over a 10-minute period, seeming to move around her campsite in a pattern that suggested deliberate investigation rather than random animal movement. She considered investigating with her flashlight, but ultimately decided to remain in her tent and wait for morning, a decision that probably saved her life by avoiding a direct confrontation under conditions that would have heavily favored the bear. The sounds eventually ceased, allowing her to drift back into an uneasy sleep, punctuated by vivid dreams of being chased through dark forests by unseen predators, imagery that her subconscious mind was processing as preparation for threats that her conscious awareness hadn't yet recognized as imminent. Her final period of deep sleep began around 1:30 a.m., during the darkest hours before dawn, when human vigilance naturally decreases and predator activity often increases due to optimal hunting conditions and reduced competition from diurnal species. At exactly 2:43 a.m. Mountain Time, according to her digital watch, which survived the subsequent attack without damage, Sarah was awakened by a sound that no amount of wilderness reading or video watching could have adequately prepared her to experience firsthand. The deep, guttural huffing that grizzly bears make when investigating interesting odors filled the air around her tent, with a bass note that seemed to vibrate through the ground and into her sleeping bag, creating an immediate understanding that something very large and very dangerous was mere feet away from where she lay helpless in her nylon shelter. The bear, later determined through DNA analysis of hair samples to be an adult male grizzly bear weighing approximately 520 pounds and measuring nearly 8 feet in length, had been attracted to the campsite by the combination of food odors from her poorly positioned bear canister and the spilled pasta sauce that had contaminated the soil near her tent. Wildlife reconstruction of the event suggested that the bear had been investigating the area for several hours, following scent trails and gradually becoming bolder, as it determined that the human presence posed no immediate threat to its access to potential food sources. Sarah's first instinct was to remain absolutely motionless in hopes that the bear would lose interest and move away, a strategy that might have been successful, if not for the wind shift that occurred at 2:45 a.m. carrying stronger food odors from her bear canister directly across her tent site and intensifying the bear's interest in accessing what it had identified as a concentrated food source. The gentle rustling sounds that she heard through her tent walls indicated the bear's systematic exploration of her campsite, including investigation of her backpack, camp chair, and other gear that might contain or have been contaminated by food odors. The critical moment occurred when the bear's investigation led it directly to her tent's vestibule, where her boots sat outside the entrance, still carrying food odors from the spilled pasta sauce despite her cleaning efforts hours earlier. The bear's powerful sense of smell, estimated to be 7 times more sensitive than a bloodhound's, easily detected these residual odors and identified her tent as the likely source of the food smells that had drawn its attention to the campsite. What happened next unfolded with the terrifying speed that characterizes dangerous wildlife encounters, transforming Sarah's peaceful wilderness experience into a survival situation that would test every aspect of her physical and psychological preparation for solo wilderness travel. The first indication of direct threat came when the bear began testing her tent's structural integrity with its massive paws, creating pressure against the rain fly that immediately made clear that her thin, nylon shelter would provide no meaningful protection against a determined predator, weighing more than 5 times her own body weight. The sound of claws scraping against fabric generated a sensory experience unlike anything in normal human experience, a combination of terror and disbelief that something so powerful was so close and apparently intent on gaining access to her vulnerable sleeping position. Her bear spray, properly positioned beside her sleeping bag for quick access during emergencies, seemed impossibly far away as her motor functions temporarily shut down under the influence of an adrenaline surge that left her simultaneously hyper-alert and physically frozen. The bear's huffing and chuffing vocalizations intensified as it continued its investigation, sounds that bear behavior specialists describe as indicators of heightened interest and potential aggression rather than the blowing or jaw-popping sounds that might indicate defensive behavior from a surprised or cornered bear. This particular combination of vocalizations suggested that the bear viewed the situation as an opportunity rather than a threat, behavioral patterns associated with food-conditioned bears that have learned to associate human campsites with accessible food sources. At 2:47 a.m., the bear made its first direct attempt to access her tent by hooking its claws through the rainfly fabric, and pulling with enough force to move the entire tent structure several inches, despite the tent stakes that anchored it to the ground. This action created the tearing sound that had punctuated her nightmares during previous uneasy sleep periods. Though the reality proved far more terrifying than anything her imagination had produced during the dark hours before dawn, Sarah's response was to emit the scream that helicopter pilot Thomas Anderson would report hearing from several miles away, a vocalization that emerged from some primitive part of her brain without conscious decision, and that seemed to briefly pause the bear's investigation efforts. However, rather than deterring the predator, her scream appeared to intensify its interest, possibly because bears often associate distress calls with wounded prey animals that represent easy feeding opportunities. The bear's renewed assault on her tent involved systematic destruction of the rainfly and outer fabric layers, creating openings that allowed its massive head to partially enter her sleeping area while she pressed herself against the far wall of the tent in a futile attempt to maximize distance from the approaching threat. The animal's enormous size became apparent as its shoulders wedged against the tent opening, revealing the true scale of North American predators to someone whose previous wildlife encounters had been limited to deer, raccoons, and other relatively small species. Her bear spray, designed to be effective against charging bears at distances up to 30 feet, seemed inadequate for close-quarters deployment inside a confined space where wind patterns and proximity might create risks of self-contamination that could incapacitate her when survival depended on maintaining mobility and clear thinking. The device remained in her hand as she calculated angles of deployment and tried to remember the operating instructions that she had practiced repeatedly at her Portland backyard under very different circumstances. The moment of truth arrived when the bear succeeded in creating an opening large enough to push its massive head completely inside her tent, bringing its eyes within 3 feet of her sleeping bag and creating direct eye contact that conveyed the intelligence and determination that made grizzly bears such formidable predators throughout their evolutionary history. The animal's breath created clouds of condensation in the cold air while its small, dark eyes evaluated this unexpected human presence with what seemed like calculated assessment rather than blind aggression. Sarah's deployment of her bear spray at this critical moment occurred with textbook technique, creating an expanding cone of capsaicin-based deterrent that filled the confined space and immediately affected both the bear and herself despite her attempts to minimize her own exposure. The bear's reaction was immediate and violent, backing out of the tent opening with vocalizations that suggested pain and confusion rather than anger, providing her with the opportunity that would determine whether she lived or died during the next crucial minutes. Her escape from the compromised tent required her to exit through the same opening the bear had created, a process that brought her into direct physical proximity with an animal that was already irritated by the chemical deterrent and potentially more dangerous due to its temporary visual impairment and confusion. However, the bear spray's effectiveness provided her with approximately 30 seconds of window during which the bear's attention was focused on relieving its own discomfort rather than pursuing her as a threat or potential food source. Sarah's choice to flee toward the largest tree in her immediate vicinity represented sound bear safety strategy, since adult grizzly bears, despite their reputation for climbing ability, typically cannot pursue adult humans up trees with trunks larger than 12 inches in diameter due to their weight and claw structure. The tree she selected, an ancient Douglas fir with a trunk diameter exceeding 30 inches, provided adequate climbing options through its lower branches while offering a trunk size that should have prevented bear pursuit. Her ascent to approximately 15 feet above ground level occurred with speed born of pure terror, adrenaline overcoming her limited tree climbing experience and allowing her to reach a height that should have represented safety from ground-based predators. However, the bear's response to her escape attempt revealed behavioral patterns that differed significantly from typical grizzly bear responses to human encounters, suggesting possible food conditioning or previous experience with human campsites that had modified its natural wariness. Rather than retreating after the bear spray deployment and loss of its intended target, the bear began what wildlife behaviorists call persistence hunting, positioning itself at the base of her tree and settling into a waiting pattern that indicated its intention to outlast her rather than abandon what it apparently still viewed as a food procurement opportunity. This behavior pattern is documented in studies of problem bears that have learned to associate human presence with accessible food sources, leading to modified hunting strategies that can persist for hours or even days. The temperature at 3 GAURM was 34 degrees Fahrenheit with light winds that increased the effective wind chill and created hypothermia risks for anyone exposed to the elements without adequate insulation. Sarah's clothing consisted of lightweight hiking pants, a merino wool base layer, and a fleece jacket, gear that was adequate for sleeping inside her rated sleeping bag but insufficient for extended exposure to near-freezing temperatures while maintaining a stationary position in a tree. Her position 15 feet above the ground provided excellent visibility of her campsite and the bear's activities, which included systematic destruction of her remaining gear as it searched for the food sources that its nose continued to detect despite her proper use of a bear canister for storage. The bear's methodical approach to gear destruction demonstrated the intelligence that has allowed grizzly bears to survive in environments where less adaptable species have disappeared, with each item investigated thoroughly before being discarded if it proved inedible. The bear's investigation of her bear canister proved particularly instructive regarding the effectiveness of required food storage methods, as the animal spent nearly 20 minutes attempting to access the container through various strategies including rolling, biting, and clawing, all of which proved unsuccessful against the device's engineered design. However, this sustained effort also demonstrated the bear's strong motivation to access what it correctly identified as a concentrated food source, suggesting that food conditioning or hunger might be driving behavior that was more persistent than typical defensive reactions. As dawn approached with agonizing slowness, Sarah's position became increasingly precarious due to cold exposure and muscle fatigue from maintaining her grip on tree branches that had not been designed to support human weight for extended periods. Her options were limited to either attempting to outlast the bear's patience or descending while the animal remained in close proximity, both strategies that carried significant risks of escalation or renewed attack. The bear's behavior during the pre-dawn hours included periodic departures from the immediate area that raised hopes of escape opportunity, but these absences proved temporary as the animal returned repeatedly to resume its vigil beneath her tree. Wildlife behavior analysis suggests that these departures represented territorial patrols or investigation of other potential food sources, rather than loss of interest in her specific location, indicating the bear's continued assessment of the situation as a worthwhile investment of time and energy. At approximately 5:30 a.m., as first light began penetrating the forest canopy and revealing the full extent of damage to her campsite, Sarah noticed subtle changes in the bear's behavior that suggested possible departure preparation. The animal's attention seemed less focused on her position and more directed towards sounds and scents that indicated other animals beginning normal daytime activity patterns, suggesting that competition from diurnal species might influence its cost-benefit analysis of continued pursuit. The decision to attempt descent from her tree refuge represented a calculated risk based on her assessment that hypothermia posed an immediate threat, while the bear's behavior suggested possible disengagement from the encounter. Her strategy involved slow movement to avoid triggering predatory chase responses, while positioning herself to deploy her backup bear spray canister if the animal showed renewed interest in her presence. Her descent to approximately 8 feet above ground level proceeded without triggering apparent bear interest, providing encouragement that the animal might indeed be transitioning to other activities as morning light eliminated the darkness conditions that favor many predator hunting strategies. However, as she reached the point where jumping to ground level became necessary, the bear's attention returned to her position with renewed intensity that suggested her movement had reactivated its interest in her as a potential food source. The critical moment of her return to ground level occurred at 5:47 a.m. when muscle fatigue and cold exposure forced her to release her grip on the lowest accessible branch and drop approximately 8 feet to the forest floor, landing within 20 feet of where the grizzly bear had been maintaining its intermittent vigil throughout the long night hours. Her landing created enough noise to immediately focus the bear's attention on her position, eliminating any hope of escaping detection during her most vulnerable moment. The bear's response was immediate and decisive, closing the 20-foot distance with the speed that makes grizzly bears capable of catching elk and other swift prey species despite their apparent bulk and ungainly appearance. Sarah's attempt to deploy her second bear spray canister was interrupted by the bear's physical contact, which knocked her backward onto the forest floor, where organic debris provided minimal cushioning against the impact of both her fall and the bear's subsequent investigation. Her decision to play dead at this crucial moment represented textbook response to grizzly bear attack scenarios, implementing the strategy recommended by wildlife safety experts for situations where escape is impossible and defensive attacks are likely. Playing dead involves lying face down with hands clasped behind the neck to protect vital areas while remaining motionless despite natural instincts to fight or flee, a counterintuitive response that requires tremendous psychological discipline under extreme stress. The bear's investigation of her motionless form included sniffing that brought its nose within inches of her head and neck, while its massive paws tested her body's response to pressure and movement, creating sensory experiences that tested the limits of her ability to maintain the death simulation. The animal's breath, carrying odors of fish, berries, and other wild foods, provided olfactory evidence of its recent feeding activities, while its vocalizations indicated continued assessment of whether she represented threat, food, or something requiring further investigation. For 17 minutes that seemed like hours, Sarah maintained her death simulation while the bear conducted what appeared to be systematic examination of her potential as a food source, including gentle mouthing behaviors that tested her skin and clothing without applying sufficient pressure to cause serious injury. This behavior pattern is documented in grizzly bear encounters where the animals appear to be assessing prey vitality rather than immediately beginning feeding behaviors, suggesting decision-making processes that evaluate energy expenditure versus nutritional benefits. The bear's apparent loss of interest coincided with increasing bird activity and distant sounds that indicated other large animals beginning normal feeding routines. Environmental changes that suggested dawn competition might influence the bear's cost-benefit assessment of continued investigation. Her motionless position was maintained for an additional 12 minutes after the bear's departure to ensure that the animal had genuinely abandoned the area, rather than simply moving to a position where continued observation was possible. When Sarah finally risked movement by slowly lifting her head and scanning her immediate surroundings, the devastation of her campsite created a scene that looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster rather than a wildlife encounter. Her tent, sleeping bag, backpack, and virtually every piece of gear had been investigated, moved, or destroyed during the bear's search for food sources, creating debris patterns that would later help wildlife biologists reconstruct the sequence of events and assess the bear's behavioral motivations. Her immediate priorities focused on assessing personal injuries, gathering essential survival items, and evacuating the area before the bear's return or encounters with other predators that might be attracted by the disturbance and scent evidence of the prolonged encounter. Her physical condition included multiple bruises and abrasions from the tree climbing and ground impact, but no serious injuries that would prevent self-rescue attempts, a remarkably fortunate outcome considering the potential for catastrophic trauma during close contact with a predator of such size and power. The survival gear assessment revealed that her emergency communication device, a satellite messenger that could transmit distress signals and GPS coordinates to emergency response services, had survived the bear's investigation intact and remained functional for signaling rescue personnel. However, her decision to attempt self-rescue rather than waiting for outside assistance was influenced by uncertainty about the bear's departure, permanence, and concern that extended presence in the area might create additional encounters with the same animal or other predators attracted to the disturbance. Her evacuation strategy involved gathering essential items including her partially damaged pack, water filtration system, emergency shelter, and remaining food supplies, while leaving behind gear that was either destroyed or too heavy for rapid movement over the 8-mile distance to the nearest road access. The decision to travel light reflected her assessment that speed and stealth represented better survival strategies than carrying equipment that might slow her progress or create noise that could attract renewed predator attention. The journey back to civilization began at 6:23 a.m. under clear skies that provided excellent visibility for navigation, while potentially exposing her to observation by wildlife species that might view a lone human as opportunity rather than threat. Her route selection prioritized established trails where possible, while avoiding areas where her outbound journey had revealed fresh bear sign or habitat features that might concentrate predator activity during morning feeding periods. Her psychological state during the evacuation combined hypervigilance with periods of emotional shock that made concentration difficult and created challenges for navigation decisions that required careful map reading and compass work. The adrenaline surge that had sustained her through the encounter gradually faded as distance from the attack site increased, revealing the true extent of her psychological trauma and raising concerns about her ability to maintain the pace necessary for reaching safety before nightfall. Wildlife encounters during her retreat included numerous deer sightings that provided reassurance about normal ecosystem function, while creating noise that masked her own movement sounds and potentially deterred predator approach. However, her heightened awareness also led to false alarms where normal forest sounds created anxiety responses that interrupted her progress and consumed psychological energy needed for sustained evacuation efforts. By 10:30 a.m., Sarah had covered approximately half the distance to road access while consuming most of her remaining water supplies and energy reserves, creating new survival challenges that required strategic decisions about pace management and resource conservation. Her clothing and equipment had proven adequate for the emergency travel despite the gear losses during the bear encounter, though increasing daytime temperatures created heat management issues that complicated hydration planning. The most challenging section of her evacuation route involved crossing a high saddle where exposure to wind and potential weather changes created additional risks while providing spectacular views of the surrounding wilderness that seemed to mock her traumatic experience with their peaceful beauty. This psychological contrast between the serene environment and her recent terror created emotional responses that threatened to overwhelm her, maintaining focus on immediate survival priorities. Her encounter with other backpackers at approximately 11:15 a.m. provided the first human contact since the attack and created opportunities for assistance with evacuation while requiring her to communicate her experience in ways that conveyed urgency without creating panic that might impair their ability to help effectively. The two hikers, experienced wilderness travelers from Colorado, immediately recognized the seriousness of her situation and provided both physical assistance with gear carrying and emotional support that helped stabilize her psychological condition. Their combined evacuation proceeded more rapidly than her solo efforts while maintaining safety protocols that reduced risks of additional wildlife encounters through noise management and group positioning strategies that provided 360-degree awareness of approaching threats. The psychological benefits of human companionship proved as valuable as the physical assistance, restoring her confidence in her ability to reach safety while processing the traumatic experience through verbal communication. The final approach to road access occurred during early afternoon hours when increasing traffic on the access road provided reassurance that civilization and professional emergency services were within reach, though her companions insisted on accompanying her to ensure that proper medical evaluation and incident reporting occurred promptly. Their vehicle, parked at the trailhead, provided immediate transportation to the nearest medical facility, while creating opportunities for notification of park authorities about the encounter location and circumstances. Her arrival at Kalispell Regional Medical Center at 2:45 p.m. initiated comprehensive medical evaluation protocols designed to assess both obvious injuries and potential complications that might not be immediately apparent following wildlife encounters, including infection risks from animal contact and delayed psychological trauma responses that could require professional intervention. The emergency department staff, experienced with wilderness medicine due to their proximity to Glacier National Park, conducted thorough examinations while documenting evidence that would support subsequent wildlife management decisions. Medical findings included multiple contusions and abrasions consistent with tree climbing and ground contact, but no serious injuries requiring surgical intervention or extended hospitalization, an outcome that physicians described as remarkably fortunate considering the potential for severe trauma during close contact with large predators. However, the medical team also initiated monitoring protocols for delayed complications, including infection, post-traumatic stress responses, and physiological stress effects that might manifest over subsequent days or weeks. The incident reporting process involved detailed interviews with park wildlife specialists who used her account to assess bear behavior patterns and determine appropriate management responses to reduce risks for future park visitors, though decisions about bear capture or elimination would ultimately depend on additional evidence gathering and policy considerations beyond her direct input. Her cooperation with this process, despite obvious emotional stress, provided crucial information for wildlife biologists studying human-bear conflict patterns and developing improved safety recommendations. Media attention following her rescue created additional stress through interview requests and public interest in her experience, though park officials helped manage these pressures while protecting her privacy during psychological recovery periods. Her story became part of ongoing research into grizzly bear behavior and human safety protocols, contributing to educational resources that might prevent similar encounters for future wilderness travelers. The long-term recovery process involved both physical healing from minor injuries and psychological counseling to address post-traumatic stress responses that affected her sleep patterns, decision-making abilities, and comfort levels in outdoor environments. Professional therapy sessions helped her process the experience while developing coping strategies that allowed gradual return to normal activities, without complete avoidance of wilderness experiences that had previously been important sources of personal satisfaction. Her relationship with wilderness travel underwent significant changes that included increased emphasis on group activities rather than solo adventures. Though she gradually regained confidence for outdoor activities through careful progression from day hikes to overnight trips with experienced companions. The experience ultimately enhanced her appreciation for wilderness safety education and her willingness to share her knowledge with other outdoor enthusiasts who might benefit from understanding the realities of predator encounters. 6 months after the encounter, Sarah returned to limited backpacking activities with experienced partners who understood her psychological needs and supported gradual exposure to wilderness environments that helped restore her confidence while respecting the legitimate caution that her experience had created. Her story became part of bear safety education programs that emphasized proper food storage, campsite selection, and response strategies while acknowledging that even careful preparation cannot eliminate all risks in predator habitat. The grizzly bear involved in her encounter was never definitively identified despite extensive tracking efforts by wildlife biologists, though DNA evidence from her campsite contributed to ongoing research about bear population genetics and individual identification methods that support wildlife management decisions. The lack of a clear resolution regarding the bear's fate created ongoing concerns about public safety, while reflecting the challenges of managing wildlife conflicts in areas where bears and humans increasingly overlap. Analysis of the encounter by bear behavior specialists revealed multiple contributing factors, including suboptimal food storage placement, campsite contamination with food odors, and seasonal stress on bear populations due to poor berry production that increased competition for alternative food sources. These findings supported recommendations for enhanced visitor education about bear safety protocols while acknowledging that some encounters may be unavoidable regardless of precautions taken by wilderness travelers. The incident occurred during a year when bear-human encounters in Glacier National Park increased by 37% compared to the previous decade average, reflecting ongoing challenges created by climate change impacts on traditional food sources, increasing human visitation to wilderness areas, and habitat fragmentation that concentrates wildlife activity in areas accessible to recreational users. These broader patterns suggested that Sarah's experience, while personally traumatic, represented part of larger environmental changes, requiring adaptive management strategies. Research conducted following the encounter contributed to improved understanding of grizzly bear persistence hunting behaviors, documented response effectiveness of commercially available bear deterrents, and identified equipment design improvements that might reduce risks for solo wilderness travelers. Sarah's cooperation with this research process, despite personal costs, provided valuable data that enhanced safety recommendations for future park visitors. Her experience became incorporated into ranger training programs that emphasized recognition of bear-human conflict patterns and development of response strategies that balanced public safety concerns with wildlife conservation objectives, creating educational value that extended beyond her personal ordeal. The case study aspects of her encounter provided realistic scenarios for training exercises that helped prepare park personnel for similar situations. Wildlife management policies were reviewed following analysis of the encounter, though no major changes were implemented due to existing regulations being deemed appropriate if properly followed, raising questions about enforcement mechanisms and visitor compliance with established safety protocols. The incident reinforced emphasis on personal responsibility for bear safety while acknowledging institutional obligations to provide adequate education and support for wilderness travelers. The psychological impact of her experience extended beyond immediate trauma responses, to include broader questions about risk assessment, personal limits, and the relationship between individual adventure-seeking and community responsibility for search and rescue resources. These philosophical considerations influenced her subsequent approach to outdoor activities while providing insights that benefited other wilderness enthusiasts considering similar adventures. Public response to her story included both supportive messages from fellow outdoor enthusiasts and criticism from individuals who questioned her decision-making and preparation adequacy, creating additional stress during recovery periods while highlighting societal attitudes toward wilderness, risk-taking, and personal responsibility. Managing these public reactions required development of communication strategies that protected her privacy while allowing beneficial sharing of safety information. Her experience ultimately contributed to broader conversations about wilderness access, safety education, and the balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility in managing public lands, topics that remain relevant as outdoor recreation continues growing in popularity, while wildlife habitat faces increasing pressure from climate change and human development. The complexity of these issues ensured that her story remained relevant beyond its immediate dramatic impact. Educational institutions incorporated her case study into wilderness safety curricula that emphasized both technical preparation and psychological readiness for emergency situations, creating lasting benefits for students who might never experience similar encounters but needed realistic understanding of wilderness risk management. Her willingness to participate in these educational efforts demonstrated remarkable resilience and commitment to preventing similar incidents for others. The encounter's documentation through multiple sources, including medical records, incident reports, DNA evidence, and photographic documentation of the attack site, created an unusually complete record that supported research applications while providing verification for insurance and legal proceedings that sometimes follow traumatic wilderness encounters. This comprehensive documentation process, while personally challenging, established precedents for thorough incident investigation that benefited subsequent cases. Long-term monitoring of her physical and psychological recovery provided medical professionals with data about trauma response patterns that informed treatment protocols for other wildlife attack victims, contributing to improved emergency medicine practices in regions where such encounters occur regularly. Her participation in follow-up studies required ongoing commitment to research objectives that sometimes conflicted with personal healing priorities. The financial impacts of her experience included medical expenses, gear replacement costs, and lost income during recovery periods, though insurance coverage and support from outdoor recreation communities helped mitigate these burdens while highlighting economic considerations that affect wilderness safety decisions. These practical concerns influenced her subsequent approach to risk management and preparation planning. Her story became part of documentary film projects that explored human-wildlife conflict themes, while raising awareness about conservation challenges facing large predator species in increasingly fragmented habitats, creating educational value that extended beyond immediate safety concerns to broader environmental issues. Participation in these projects required careful balance between personal privacy needs and public education benefits. The encounter's timing during peak autumn bear activity periods provided insights into seasonal risk factors that influenced park management recommendations for visitor safety, including enhanced food storage enforcement and modified backcountry permit policies during high-risk periods. These policy implications demonstrated how individual incidents can contribute to systemic improvements in wilderness management. Research applications of her experience extended to equipment testing programs that evaluated bear deterrent effectiveness, emergency communication device reliability, and shelter design improvements that might enhance survival prospects during similar encounters. Her feedback regarding gear performance under extreme stress conditions provided manufacturers with realistic testing scenarios for product development. The psychological counseling process revealed trauma response patterns that differed from urban violence or accident scenarios, contributing to specialized treatment approaches for wilderness trauma that acknowledged unique environmental and cultural factors affecting recovery processes. These insights benefited other outdoor enthusiasts facing similar psychological challenges following wilderness emergencies. Her gradual return to wilderness activities became a study in trauma recovery that demonstrated both the possibility of healing and the permanent changes that significant survival experiences create in individual risk assessment and environmental relationships. This recovery process provided hope for other trauma survivors while acknowledging that complete return to previous comfort levels might not be realistic or necessary. Community response to her experience included enhanced local search and rescue training programs that incorporated lessons learned from her encounter while building capacity for similar emergency responses, creating lasting benefits for regional outdoor recreation safety. Her participation in these training programs contributed expertise based on actual survival experience rather than theoretical scenarios. The encounter occurred during a period when wildlife management agencies were reassessing traditional approaches to human-bear conflict resolution, providing real-world data that informed policy discussions about bear relocation versus elimination decisions following aggressive encounters. Her input during these policy deliberations carried weight due to her direct experience with the consequences of management decisions. Scientific publications resulting from analysis of her encounter contributed to peer-reviewed literature about grizzly bear behavior, human safety protocols, and wildlife management strategies while maintaining appropriate confidentiality regarding personal details that weren't relevant to research objectives. These publications ensured that knowledge gained from her experience reached professional audiences who could implement improvements. Her story's integration into National Park Service educational materials provided standardized case study content for visitor safety programs while demonstrating realistic consequences of safety protocol violations without sensationalizing wilderness dangers. This educational application balanced fear-based deterrence with informed risk assessment that supported appropriate wilderness recreation decisions. The encounter's analysis revealed communication gaps between different agencies involved in wilderness safety, leading to improved coordination protocols that enhanced emergency response effectiveness while reducing duplication of effort during crisis situations. These systemic improvements benefited all wilderness users rather than just those experiencing emergencies. Her experience became reference material for insurance industry risk assessment protocols that influenced coverage decisions and premium structures for wilderness recreation activities, creating broader economic impacts that affected access and affordability for outdoor enthusiasts. Understanding these insurance implications helped inform individual preparation and risk management strategies. The incident's documentation contributed to legal precedent regarding personal responsibility and institutional liability in wilderness settings, influencing how courts evaluate negligence claims and duty of care obligations in subsequent cases involving recreational injuries or fatalities. These legal implications extended beyond her personal experience to affect wilderness management policies. Media coverage of her story influenced public perceptions about wilderness safety and bear behavior while occasionally perpetuating misconceptions that required correction through follow-up education efforts, demonstrating the challenges of accurate science communication in sensationalized media environments. Managing these communication challenges became an ongoing responsibility that extended well beyond the initial encounter. Her recovery process highlighted the importance of social support networks in trauma healing while revealing how wilderness emergencies can affect family relationships, career decisions, and life priorities in ways that extend far beyond immediate medical concerns. These broader impact patterns provided insights that benefited other trauma survivors and their support networks. The encounter's timing relative to seasonal bear behavior patterns provided data about hyperphagia period risks that influenced park closure decisions and visitor education emphasis during high-risk periods, creating management implications that affected thousands of subsequent visitors. Her contribution to these policy discussions helped balance safety concerns with access preservation. Years after the encounter, Sarah's continued involvement in wilderness safety education demonstrated remarkable resilience while contributing to ongoing improvements in preparation strategies, emergency response protocols, and trauma recovery resources that benefited countless other outdoor enthusiasts. Her story became part of the institutional memory that shapes wilderness management decisions and safety recommendations. The encounter ultimately raised profound questions about humanity's relationship with wilderness environments, individual responsibility for managing inherent risks, and societal obligations to support both wildlife conservation and recreational access that remain relevant as outdoor recreation continues evolving. These philosophical dimensions ensured that her experience contributed to broader conversations about environmental ethics and outdoor recreation values. Her willingness to share details of this traumatic experience, despite personal costs and ongoing psychological challenges, demonstrated remarkable courage and commitment to preventing similar incidents for other wilderness travelers. The educational value of her story continues benefiting outdoor enthusiasts who learn from her experience while pursuing their own wilderness adventures with enhanced awareness and improved preparation. The questions that emerge from Sarah's encounter continue resonating with anyone who ventures into wild places where humans remain visitors rather than controllers, where ancient predators still rule territories that predate civilization by millions of years, and where the margin for error remains as narrow as the difference between proper food storage and tragic miscalculation. How do we balance our desire for authentic wilderness experiences with realistic assessment of inherent dangers that no amount of preparation can completely eliminate? What level of risk is acceptable when pursuing activities that provide profound personal satisfaction but carry potential for catastrophic consequences? How do individual stories of survival and trauma contribute to broader understanding of our proper relationship with wild places and the creatures that call them home? Can we maintain wilderness areas that remain genuinely wild while ensuring reasonable safety for the millions of people who seek renewal and adventure in these last strongholds of untamed America? What responsibilities do we bear, both individually and collectively, for the consequences of our choices to venture into places where we are no longer the apex predator? How do experiences like Sarah's change our understanding of what it truly means to be human in a world where wildness still exists, where ancient dramas of predator and prey continue playing out according to rules far older than our civilization, and where the difference between wonder and terror can be measured in heartbeats rather than miles? These questions deserve our continued attention as we navigate the complex relationship between human recreation and wildlife conservation in an increasingly crowded and developed world where true wilderness becomes more precious with each passing year. The next stories. The first thing rescue helicopter pilot Maria Santos noticed was the glint of something metallic catching the afternoon sun on the rocky ledge below. A flash of silver that shouldn't have been there among the granite outcroppings and alpine juniper of Colorado's Front Range. Banking her aircraft in a wide circle 300 feet above the narrow canyon, she adjusted her polarized sunglasses and peered down at what appeared to be a twisted piece of equipment scattered across the stone shelf. Through her headset, she called to her partner Dave Richardson, seated beside her with binoculars already pressed to his eyes. The wind buffeted their helicopter as they descended for a closer look, the rotors beating a rhythmic thrum that echoed off the canyon walls. What they discovered on that ledge would haunt both of them for years to come, though neither could have imagined the hours of terror that had preceded their arrival. A runner's hydration pack lay torn and shredded, its contents spilled across the rocks in a pattern that suggested violence. Nearby, a single running shoe sat upright as if carefully placed, its bright orange sole stark against the gray stone. Dark stains marked the granite, and scratches in the rock face told a story of desperate struggle. The silence below seemed absolute except for the wind whistling through the canyon. But something was wrong with that silence, something that made Maria's skin crawl even before she spotted the movement in the shadows beneath an overhanging boulder. A figure huddled there, motionless except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of labored breathing. Through the binoculars, Dave could see torn clothing, blood-matted hair, and skin that bore the unmistakable marks of claws and teeth. The person appeared to be conscious but trapped, unable or unwilling to move from their position against the rock face. Most disturbing of all was what paced back and forth on the ledge above the injured figure, a massive black shape that paused occasionally to rear up on its hind legs and test the air with its nose before dropping back down to continue its patient vigil. The bear showed no fear of the helicopter, no inclination to flee despite the noise and downdraft from the rotors. Instead, it seemed to be standing guard, protecting something precious hidden in the rocks nearby. Two smaller shapes darted between the boulders, cubs that couldn't be more than a few months old, their playful movements a stark contrast to their mother's aggressive posturing. This was no ordinary rescue scenario, and both pilots knew that approaching the victim would require more than medical expertise. They would need to convince 300 pounds of protective mother to abandon her position or find another way to reach the broken figure huddled below. The afternoon shadows were lengthening, and with nightfall would come dropping temperatures that could prove fatal to someone suffering from exposure and blood loss. Time was running out, and the bear showed no signs of leaving. To understand how this desperate scene had unfolded, how a simple morning run had transformed into a life-or-death struggle against one of North America's most formidable predators, we must go back 18 hours earlier, to a time when the greatest concern on Jake Morrison's mind was whether he had packed enough energy gels for his planned 20-mile training run through some of Colorado's most spectacular and unforgiving wilderness. The Colorado Front Range rises from the Great Plains like a massive granite wall, its peaks climbing from an elevation of 5,000 feet at the foothills to over 14,000 feet at the summits of the highest mountains. This dramatic landscape was carved over millions of years by the forces of glaciation, tectonic uplift, and erosion, creating a complex ecosystem that stretches from prairie grasslands through montane forests to alpine tundra above the tree line. The specific location where Jake Morrison would encounter his nightmare lies within the boundaries of Roosevelt National Forest, approximately 45 miles northwest of Denver and 15 miles west of the mountain town of Estes Park. The area encompasses part of the Mummy Range, a series of peaks that form the northern boundary of Rocky Mountain National Park. Though Jake's planned route would take him through national forest lands just outside the park boundary where regulations are less restrictive and solitude more easily found. The nearest paved road lies 8 miles to the east, accessible only by a rough four-wheel drive track that winds through stands of aspen and ponderosa pine before ending at a primitive trailhead marked by nothing more than a weathered wooden sign and a small parking area carved from the forest. Cell phone coverage is non-existent in this remote valley, and the nearest ranger station sits 23 miles away on the opposite side of the Continental Divide. The landscape here reflects the violent geological history of the region, with exposed granite cliffs rising vertically for hundreds of feet above narrow valleys carved by long-vanished glaciers. Ancient Precambrian rock, some of the oldest stone on Earth, forms the backbone of these mountains, pushed upward by tectonic forces and sculpted by ice and water into the dramatic formations that attract climbers and photographers from around the world. The valley where Jake would make his fateful encounter follows the path of an old glacial moraine, its floor littered with massive boulders deposited by retreating ice sheets 10,000 years ago. These house-sized rocks create a maze of hidden passages and blind corners, perfect ambush terrain for predators, and a nightmare for anyone trying to navigate quickly through unfamiliar country. Native American tribes, primarily the Ute and Arapaho peoples, considered this region sacred hunting grounds for generations before European settlement, following game trails that still exist today and leaving behind occasional petroglyphs on sheltered rock faces. Mountain men and fur trappers explored these valleys in the early 1800s seeking beaver pelts and establishing routes that would later become mining roads during Colorado's gold and silver booms. The area saw limited mining activity in the late 19th century, evidenced by the rusted remains of an old stamp mill visible from certain vantage points along the ridge, though the ore deposits proved too sparse for profitable extraction. Today, the region remains largely undeveloped, protected by its designation as national forest, and by the simple difficulty of accessing its most remote corners. The climate in this part of Colorado reflects the dramatic elevation changes and continental location, with conditions varying significantly between seasons and even from hour to hour during transition periods. Winters are harsh and prolonged, with snow typically covering the high valleys from October through May and temperatures dropping well. Below zero during the coldest months, spring arrives late and tentatively, often interrupted by sudden blizzards that can dump several feet of snow even in May or early June. Summer provides a brief window of relative warmth and accessibility, though afternoon thunderstorms are common and can bring dangerous lightning, flash flooding, and sudden temperature drops. Fall comes early to the high country, with aspen leaves typically turning golden by early September, and the first snows often arriving before the end of the month. The year Jake Morrison chose for his ambitious training run had been unusual in several respects, with a particularly mild winter followed by an exceptionally early spring thaw. Snow had disappeared from the lower elevations by mid-March, nearly 2 months earlier than normal, and the mountain streams were running higher than usual due to rapid snowmelt from the peaks. Daytime temperatures in late May had been reaching into the 70s at the 7,000-foot elevation where Jake planned to run, though nighttime lows still dropped into the 40s and could fall below freezing at higher elevations. The extended mild weather had brought both benefits and hidden dangers to the ecosystem. Wildflowers were blooming in profusion, creating spectacular displays of color across mountain meadows, but the early snowmelt had also disrupted normal wildlife patterns. Bears emerging from hibernation found their usual food sources either not yet available or already past peak nutrition, forcing them to expand their foraging ranges and increasing the likelihood of encounters with humans. Weather forecasts for Jake's planned run called for partly cloudy skies with afternoon temperatures in the low 70s. Perfect conditions for a long training run, though with the usual caveat about possible afternoon thunderstorms that could develop rapidly in the mountains. Humidity levels were lower than normal due to an ongoing drought that had left vegetation tinder dry despite the early snowmelt, creating additional fire danger but also providing ideal conditions for extended outdoor activity. Wind patterns in the valley where Jake would run tend to be light in the morning, building through the day as thermal updrafts develop along the sun-warmed rock faces, then shifting direction and gaining intensity as afternoon thunderstorms approach. The plant life in this montane ecosystem creates a complex vertical structure that dramatically affects visibility, movement, and animal behavior throughout the region. The dominant tree species at the elevation where Jake planned to run is the ponderosa pine, massive specimens that can reach heights of over 100 feet and live for several centuries. These giants create an open park-like understory due to their allelopathic properties and their tendency to self-thin through periodic ground fires that historically swept through the area every few decades. Between the ponderosa pines, scattered groves of quaking aspen provide brilliant fall color and important browse for wildlife, their white bark scarred by the claws and teeth of bears marking territory and seeking the sweet cambium layer beneath the surface. Douglas fir occupies the cooler, north-facing slopes and drainage bottoms, creating dense stands that can significantly limit visibility and provide perfect hiding spots for large animals. The understory varies dramatically depending on aspect, elevation, and moisture availability, ranging from open areas carpeted with native grasses and wildflowers to impenetrable thickets of gamble oak that can grow higher than a person's head and create what locals call oak brush hell for anyone trying to travel cross-country. Rocky slopes support hardy shrubs, including kinnikinick, mahonia, and various species of currant and gooseberry that produce berries, crucial to bear nutrition during late summer and fall. Spring wildflower displays can be spectacular in years with adequate moisture, with entire meadows turned purple with lupine, red with Indian paintbrush, and yellow with glacier lilies and mountain sunflowers. The specific area where Jake's encounter would occur features a mix of mature ponderosa pine forest with dense understory growth along a seasonal creek drainage, creating an environment where a large animal could remain concealed until someone was within very close range. Mountain mahogany and surrisberry bushes provide additional cover along the rocky slopes, while patches of kinnikinick create a thick ground cover that muffles the sound of approaching footsteps. Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir begin to appear at higher elevations, marking the transition toward the subalpine zone where growing seasons are short and conditions become increasingly harsh. The diverse plant community supports an equally complex food web from the smallest insects and soil organisms to the massive ungulates and predators that depend on this mountain ecosystem for survival. The wildlife inhabiting this remote corner of Colorado represents a complete Rocky Mountain ecosystem largely unchanged from the conditions encountered by Native American hunters centuries ago. Elk populations in the region are robust, with herds numbering in the hundreds that migrate seasonally between higher summer ranges and lower wintering areas, creating well-worn trails that crisscross the mountains and provide easy travel routes for both animals and humans. Mule deer are abundant throughout the area, their large ears and distinctive bouncing gait making them easy to identify as they bound through the oak brush and pine forests. White-tailed deer occupy the riparian areas along permanent streams, preferring the denser cover and more reliable water sources found in these habitats. Mountain goats inhabit the highest peaks and cliff faces, visible as white dots against the gray granite walls to anyone with binoculars and patience. Bighorn sheep historically occupied the area, but were extirpated by disease and hunting pressure in the early 20th century, though reintroduction efforts have established small populations in adjacent areas. Predator populations reflect the abundant prey base, with mountain lions occupying large territories that can encompass dozens of square miles. These cats are rarely seen but frequently present, as evidenced by tracks, scat, and the occasional discovery of cached prey buried under brush and debris. Gray wolves were eliminated from Colorado in the 1940s but are gradually recolonizing from populations in Wyoming and Montana, with confirmed sightings becoming increasingly common in the northern part of the state. Coyotes are abundant and vocal, their evening chorus echoing through the valleys as packs communicate across vast territories. The region supports healthy populations of smaller predators including bobcats, foxes, martens, and weasels, each filling specific ecological niches in the complex food web. Bird life is diverse and seasonally variable, with year-round residents like gray jays, Clark's nutcrackers, and various woodpecker species joined by migratory songbirds during summer months. Raptors include golden eagles, red-tailed hawks, and occasionally peregrine falcons, while great horned owls and great gray owls hunt during nighttime hours. The presence of black bears in this ecosystem represents both a conservation success story and an ongoing management challenge. Colorado's black bear population has grown from fewer than 12,000 animals in the 1960s to an estimated 19 to 20,000 today, making it the largest bear population in the contiguous United States. Bears in this region typically emerge from winter dens in April or early May, with adult males emerging first, followed by females with cubs, though the unusually early spring of Jake's encounter year had disrupted these normal patterns. Adult males can weigh up to 400 pounds and reach 6 feet in length, while females are typically smaller, ranging from 150 to 300 pounds. Despite their name, black bears in Colorado display a wide range of color phases, from the typical black to brown, cinnamon, and even blonde coloration. Their diet consists primarily of vegetation, including grasses, forbs, berries, and nuts, though they are opportunistic omnivores that will take advantage of carrion, insects, small mammals, and occasionally larger prey when opportunities arise. During late summer and fall, bears enter a phase called hyperphagia, consuming up to 20,000 calories per day in preparation for winter hibernation. This behavior makes them particularly food-motivated and potentially dangerous during encounters with humans carrying food or scented items. The bear population in the specific area where Jake planned to run had been increasing in recent years, with wildlife officials documenting at least 6 different individual bears using the valley during the previous summer, including 2 females with cubs. Recent bear activity in the area had been higher than normal due to the early snowmelt disrupting natural food cycles, forcing bears to travel greater distances and explore new areas in search of adequate nutrition. Sightings had been reported by hikers and fishermen throughout the spring, though no aggressive encounters had been documented, creating a false sense of security among regular users of the area. Jake Morrison had turned 34 just 2 weeks before his planned mountain training run, an age when many amateur athletes begin to accept the declining performance that comes with advancing years. But Jake remained stubbornly committed to improving his marathon times, even as his body showed the accumulated wear of 15 years of competitive running. Standing 6 feet 1 inch tall with the lean, efficient build typical of elite distance runners, Jake carried only 155 pounds on his frame, every ounce of excess weight stripped away through years of high-mileage training and careful attention to nutrition. His dark brown hair, perpetually shortened in a practical buzz cut that required minimal maintenance, showed the first hints of gray at the temples, a development that annoyed him more than he cared to admit to his friends and family. Green eyes that inherited their color from his Irish grandmother reflected an intensity that had served him well in his professional career as a civil engineer, but sometimes made social interactions challenging for those who didn't understand his driven personality. Born and raised in the Denver suburb of Arvada, Jake had discovered running during his sophomore year at Arvada West High School, when a soccer injury ended his dreams of playing collegiate sports. What began as cross-country training to maintain fitness had evolved into a passion that defined his identity and consumed most of his free time for nearly 2 decades. His parents, both schoolteachers who valued education and hard work above athletic achievement, had initially viewed his running obsession with bemused tolerance, but gradually came to understand that for Jake, running represented something deeper than simple recreation or fitness. His father, Michael Morrison, had been a weekend warrior himself, playing recreational basketball until his knees gave out in his 40s. and he recognized in his son's dedication to training the same competitive drive that had pushed him through a master's degree in education while working full-time. Jake's mother, Sarah Morrison, worried constantly about her son's tendency to push his body beyond reasonable limits, but had learned to express her concerns indirectly rather than face the stubborn resistance that direct criticism inevitably provoked. Jake had earned his civil engineering degree from the Colorado School of Mines, chosen specifically because the Golden campus provided easy access to mountain trails where he could train at altitude while pursuing his studies. His undergraduate years had been marked by a rigid schedule of morning runs, afternoon classes, and evening study sessions, with social activities relegated to whatever time remained after these priorities were satisfied. Professors remembered him as a serious student who rarely spoke in class but consistently produced thoughtful, technically sound work that reflected both natural ability and meticulous preparation. Classmates found him friendly but distant, someone who could be counted on for help with difficult assignments, but who rarely joined them for the parties and social gatherings that defined the college experience for most students. Upon graduation, Jake had been hired by a mid-sized engineering consulting firm specializing in municipal infrastructure projects, work that appealed to his methodical nature and provided the stable income necessary to support his running goals. His current position as a project manager involved overseeing the design and construction of water treatment facilities, storm drainage systems, and roadway improvements throughout the Denver metropolitan area. Colleagues respected his technical expertise and reliability, but often found his intensity exhausting during long project meetings or stressful deadline periods. Jake approached his professional responsibilities with the same systematic dedication he brought to training, maintaining detailed project schedules and refusing to accept substandard work from contractors or subconsultants. His office walls displayed not family photos or vacation souvenirs, but rather a collection of race, medals, finish line photographs, and charts tracking his personal records across various distances. The marathon had become his primary focus 3 years earlier when he finally acknowledged that his times in shorter distances had plateaued, despite increasingly aggressive training regimens. His personal best of 2 hours and 43 minutes, achieved at the Denver Marathon the previous fall, had qualified him for the Boston Marathon but fell short of the sub-240 goal that consumed his thoughts during every training run. Family relationships had suffered somewhat under the demands of his training schedule, particularly with his younger sister Jennifer, who lived in California and visited Denver infrequently. Jennifer worked in marketing for a technology company and lived a lifestyle that Jake found frivolous and unfocused, while she viewed her brother's single-minded pursuit of running goals as obsessive and unhealthy. Their parents served as reluctant mediators during family gatherings, carefully steering conversations away from topics that might trigger arguments between their children. Jake remained single despite his mother's periodic suggestions that he consider dating, claiming that serious relationships required time and emotional energy he preferred to devote to training and career advancement. This explanation satisfied no one, least of all Jake himself, who privately acknowledged that his lifestyle choices had more to do with fear of vulnerability than lack of time. The circle of people who knew Jake well enough to be considered friends rather than mere acquaintances was surprisingly small for someone who had lived his entire life in the same metropolitan area. His closest companion was probably Rick Hendricks, a fellow engineer 3 years younger who worked for a competing firm and served as Jake's primary training partner for longer runs. Rick possessed a more balanced approach to running that included regular recovery days, off-season breaks, and a social life that extended beyond the running community, qualities that Jake privately envied but couldn't bring himself to emulate. Their friendship had developed gradually over several years of encountering each other at local races and group training runs, built on mutual respect for each other's dedication, and a shared understanding of the sacrifices required for serious competitive running. Rick's girlfriend Amanda tolerated Jake's presence on their longer training runs but made no secret of her belief that his influence encouraged Rick to train harder than was healthy or sustainable. The tension between Amanda and Jake remained largely unspoken, but occasionally surfaced during post-run social gatherings when Amanda would make pointed comments about the importance of moderation and life balance. Other members of Jake's running circle included Tom Patterson, a 42-year-old teacher who had competed in the Olympics trials during his college years and now served as an unofficial coach for several local distance runners, and Maria Santos, a nurse practitioner whose scientific approach to training and recovery had helped her maintain competitive performances well into her 30s. The group met regularly for long runs on weekends, following routes that often extended into the foothills and mountains west of Denver. But Jake frequently found their pace too conservative for his training needs and would either start early to add extra miles or continue beyond their planned stopping points. This behavior created subtle friction within the group, as other members interpreted Jake's modifications to their planned workouts as implicit criticism of their own commitment or ability. The dynamics became particularly complicated when someone suggested a group trip or multi-day adventure, as Jake's rigid training schedule and reluctance to travel anywhere that didn't offer suitable running opportunities made him a difficult companion for anything resembling a vacation. His relationship with Tom Patterson was complex, built on genuine respect for Tom's racing accomplishments, but complicated by Jake's resistance to accepting advice or coaching from anyone else. Tom had suggested on multiple occasions that Jake would benefit from working with a qualified coach and following a more structured training program, but Jake preferred the control that came with designing his own workouts and setting his own schedule. This independence had served him well in many respects, allowing him to adapt his training to the demands of his work schedule and personal preferences. But it also meant that he lacked the objective perspective that might have warned him against some of his more ambitious plans. The specific training plan that would lead Jake into the Colorado wilderness on that fateful morning in May had been evolving in his mind for several months, born from a combination of his desire to break 2:40 in the marathon and his belief that altitude training represented his best opportunity for significant improvement. He had spent countless hours researching the training methods used by elite distance runners, particularly those who lived and trained at altitude, and had become convinced that his sea-level training in Denver wasn't providing sufficient physiological stress to stimulate the adaptations necessary for faster racing. His plan called for a series of increasingly ambitious training runs in the mountains, building from familiar trails close to Boulder and Golden to more remote locations that would challenge him both physically and mentally. The route he selected for this particular run had been identified during hours of studying topographic maps and satellite imagery, a 20-mile loop that would take him through some of the most spectacular scenery in the Front Range while providing nearly 3,000 feet of elevation gain. Starting from the primitive trailhead at 7,000 feet elevation, the route followed an abandoned mining road for the first 5 miles, gaining elevation gradually through mixed forest before reaching a high meadow at approximately 9,000 feet. From there, the plan called for him to follow a network of game trails and faint hiking paths across a series of ridges and valleys, navigation that would require map and compass skills he had been practicing during shorter runs closer to home. The most challenging section would be a 3-mile stretch through largely trailless terrain, where he would need to maintain his direction using landscape features and occasional cairns left by previous travelers. This portion of the route would take him through the valley where his encounter with the bear family would occur, though he had no way of knowing that the remote drainage he had selected for its solitude and natural beauty was also the chosen denning area for a female black bear and her 2 cubs. Jake's preparation for the run had been characteristically thorough and systematic, involving not just physical training, but extensive research into navigation techniques, emergency procedures, and wilderness safety protocols. He had purchased updated topographic maps of the area and spent hours studying the terrain features, identifying landmarks and escape routes, should weather or other emergencies arise during the run. His gear selection reflected his engineering background, with every item carefully evaluated for its weight, utility, and reliability. He planned to carry a lightweight hydration pack containing 3 liters of water, energy gels for fuel, a first aid kit, an emergency space blanket, a whistle, and a small flashlight in case the run took longer than anticipated. Navigation would be handled by a combination of map and compass backup by a GPS unit, though he was aware that satellite reception could be unreliable in the deep valleys and steep terrain he planned to traverse. Jake had debated whether to carry bear spray, a decision that would prove crucial to his survival, ultimately choosing to leave it behind based on his research suggesting that bear encounters were extremely rare in the area during late spring. This decision reflected a common misconception among outdoor enthusiasts who focus on historical data rather than current conditions, failing to account for the early spring and disrupted wildlife patterns that had increased bear activity throughout the region. His communication plan was minimal, consisting of a brief email to Rick Hendricks outlining his planned route and expected return time, sent the evening before his departure with instructions to contact authorities if he failed to check in by Monday morning. This precaution had seemed adequate given Jake's experience and the relatively well-defined nature of his planned route, though it would prove insufficient given the remote location and lack of cell coverage in the area where he would encounter trouble. The journey from Jake's Denver apartment to the remote trailhead began in darkness, with his alarm sounding at 4:30 a.m. on what promised to be a perfect spring morning for mountain running. His pre-run routine had been refined through years of early morning starts, a precise sequence of activities designed to fuel his body and prepare his mind for the challenges ahead. Coffee came first, a strong dark roast that he consumed while checking weather forecasts and reviewing his planned route one final time. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal with banana and honey, chosen for its combination of complex carbohydrates and quick-digesting sugars that would provide steady energy throughout the morning. He had loaded his truck the previous evening, ensuring that all gear was properly organized and that emergency supplies, including extra food, water, and warm clothing, were available in case his run extended longer than planned or conditions deteriorated unexpectedly. The drive to the trailhead would take approximately 2 hours, following Interstate 25 north from Denver, before turning west on increasingly narrow roads that wound through mountain communities and national forest lands. During the first hour of driving, Jake occupied his mind by listening to podcasts about training techniques and race strategy. But as he left the highway and began climbing into the mountains, he turned off the audio and drove in contemplative silence, mentally rehearsing the challenges ahead and visualizing successful completion of his planned route. The transition from urban landscapes to mountain wilderness never failed to excite him, watching the sun rise over the plains behind him while peaks ahead emerged from shadow into brilliant morning light. Housing developments and shopping centers gave way to ranches and hayfields, which in turn yielded to dense forests of pine and aspen as the road climbed steadily westward. The final miles to the trailhead followed a rough dirt road that tested his truck's suspension and reminded him how isolated his destination really was, passing only one other vehicle during the entire climb to the parking area. Arriving at the trailhead slightly ahead of his planned schedule, Jake took time to adjust his gear, double-check his navigation equipment, and consume a final energy gel before beginning his run. The morning air was crisp and still, carrying the scent of pine resin and wood smoke from a distant campfire, while bird songs provided a cheerful soundtrack that would soon be replaced by the rhythmic sound of his breathing and footsteps. He spent several minutes stretching and warming up his muscles, paying particular attention to his calves and hip flexors, which tended to tighten during long mountain runs, before locking his truck and stashing the keys in a small magnetic box attached to the undercarriage. A brief moment of doubt crossed his mind as he looked at the primitive trail disappearing into the forest, wondering if he should have chosen a more familiar route for such an ambitious training run, but the feeling passed quickly as his competitive nature reasserted itself and he began running at an easy pace that felt sustainable for the long day ahead. The first few miles passed quickly along the abandoned mining road, his legs feeling strong and his breathing comfortable despite the thin mountain air, while his mind settled into the meditative state that made long runs both challenging and deeply satisfying. Wildlife was abundant during these early miles, with several deer bounding away through the trees and a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, but he saw no sign of the bears whose presence would soon transform his peaceful training run into a desperate struggle for survival. The first hints that Jake's carefully planned route might involve more wildlife encounters than he had anticipated came approximately 8 miles into his run, when he discovered fresh bear tracks in a muddy section of trail beside a small creek. The prints were clearly visible in the soft earth, large enough to indicate an adult bear, and recent enough that water was still seeping into the depressions from the surrounding soil. Jake paused to examine the tracks more closely, his engineering training making him naturally observant of details that others might overlook, noting the size and spacing of the prints as well as the direction of travel which seemed to parallel his own planned route. Each print measured approximately 8 inches long and 6 inches wide, larger than he had expected based on his limited knowledge of black bear anatomy, with clearly visible claw marks extending another 2 inches beyond the toe pads. The depth of the impression suggested a heavy animal, probably in the 300-pound range, though Jake had no practical experience for estimating bear weights from track characteristics alone. More concerning was the presence of much smaller tracks alongside the adult prints, unmistakable evidence that cubs were present, and that any encounter with this bear family would be particularly dangerous. Female bears with cubs are notoriously protective and unpredictable, quick to perceive threats and willing to fight ferociously to defend their offspring. But Jake's limited knowledge of bear behavior failed to appreciate the full implications of this discovery. His reaction was a mixture of excitement at seeing evidence of wildlife and mild concern about the possibility of an unexpected encounter. But he convinced himself that the tracks were probably several hours old and that the bears had likely moved far from the area where he planned to run. This rationalization reflected a common human tendency to minimize perceived risks when pursuing desired goals, a psychological bias that would prove nearly fatal in the hours ahead. Jake spent several minutes photographing the tracks with his phone, thinking they would make interesting additions to his social media posts about the training run, before resuming his pace and continuing along his planned route. The discovery of bear sign should have prompted a reassessment of his plans, perhaps suggesting a retreat to his truck and a different route for the day. But Jake's commitment to completing his scheduled workout overrode his caution, and he pressed onward into increasingly remote terrain. Over the next several miles, he discovered additional sign of bear presence, including several trees marked with claw marks, where animals had stretched to reach scent glands or perhaps simply to mark territory. The scratches in the bark were fresh, with sap still weeping from some of the deeper gouges, and extended higher up the trunk than Jake could reach with his outstretched arms, suggesting bears of considerable size and strength. Scat was visible at several locations along the trail, containing the fibrous remains of grasses and sedges that comprised the bear's early spring diet, along with fragments of what appeared to be insect chitin from beetles and other invertebrates. The biological evidence painted a clear picture of active bear populations in the area, information that should have triggered Jake's retreat, but instead seemed to enhance his sense of adventure and connection with the wild landscape he was traversing. His pace remained steady and his confidence high as he navigated the technical terrain of the middle sections of his route, using map and compass to stay oriented while following faint game trails through dense forest and across open meadows brilliant with wildflowers. The afternoon sun was approaching its zenith when Jake reached the most remote section of his planned route, a valley that appeared on his topographic map as a blank space between contour lines, unmarked by trails or human infrastructure of any kind. This was exactly the type of pristine wilderness he had hoped to experience, a place where he could test his navigation skills and enjoy complete solitude while pushing his body through demanding terrain at significant altitude. The descent into the valley required careful attention to footing as he picked his way down steep slopes covered with loose rock and fallen timber, terrain that would be challenging to climb back out of should retreat become necessary. Pine and aspen gave way to dense thickets of willows and mountain mahogany as he approached the valley floor, vegetation that created perfect cover for wildlife while severely limiting visibility for anyone traveling through the area. A small creek meandered through the bottom of the valley, its banks lined with lush grass and wildflowers that created an almost park-like setting despite the remote location. Jake felt a surge of satisfaction at successfully navigating to this beautiful spot, his confidence in his route-finding abilities validated by reaching exactly the landmark he had identified on his maps during weeks of planning. The creek provided an opportunity to refill his water bottles and consume another energy gel while enjoying the spectacular mountain scenery surrounding him, peaks rising dramatically on all sides to create an amphitheater of granite and forest that felt like a natural cathedral. Birds sang from the willows along the creek, and the sound of running water provided a peaceful backdrop that made it difficult to imagine any danger in such an idyllic setting. Jake allowed himself a brief rest, perhaps 10 minutes, to stretch his legs and prepare for the challenging climb that would take him out of the valley and onto the ridge system that marked the halfway point of his planned route. His legs felt strong despite the technical terrain he had already covered, and his energy levels remained high thanks to careful attention to nutrition and pacing throughout the morning. The temperature had risen into the comfortable range where he could run in shorts and a lightweight shirt, though he carried additional layers in his pack should weather conditions change during the afternoon hours, when mountain storms often develop with little warning. As he prepared to resume running, Jake noticed a flock of birds suddenly take flight from the willows downstream from his position, their alarmed calls breaking the peaceful silence that had pervaded the valley. The disturbance seemed unusual given the calm conditions and lack of wind that might explain their sudden departure. But Jake attributed the incident to his own presence in an area where wildlife encounters with humans were probably rare. This explanation satisfied his rational mind, while his subconscious registered the first subtle warning that something in the valley was not quite right, a feeling that he dismissed in favor of maintaining his planned schedule and completing his training run according to the ambitious goals he had set for himself. The second warning came less than half an hour later as Jake worked his way up the steep hillside on the far side of the valley. His breathing labored from the combination of altitude and the technical climbing required to navigate the boulder-strewn slope. A sound echoed through the forest that was unlike anything he had heard before during his years of mountain running, a huffing or chuffing noise that seemed too loud and too low in pitch to come from any bird or small mammal. Jake paused in his climbing to listen more carefully, his heart rate elevated from exertion, but his senses alert to the possibility that he was not alone in the remote valley. The sound came again, closer this time and clearly emanating from the thick vegetation below his position, followed by what sounded like branches breaking under the weight of a large animal moving through the underbrush. Every instinct told him to freeze and remain silent while whatever was making the noise passed through the area, but his curiosity overcame his caution and he began moving laterally along the slope to get a better view of the valley floor. Through gaps in the vegetation, he caught a glimpse of black fur moving among the willows, confirming his suspicion that he was sharing the valley with at least one bear, though the distance and dense cover prevented him from determining the animal's size or behavior. Jake's first impulse was excitement at the opportunity to observe a bear in its natural habitat, an experience that few people are privileged to enjoy. But this feeling was quickly tempered by awareness that his position on the steep hillside would make retreat difficult should the bear discover his presence and react aggressively. Bear behavior in such encounters is notoriously unpredictable, ranging from complete indifference to human presence to explosive charges that can cover considerable distances in seconds, and Jake had no way of knowing which type of response to expect from the animal below. His decision to continue observing rather than immediately leaving the area reflected the same overconfidence that had led him to dismiss the earlier warning signs, a belief that his fitness and familiarity with mountain terrain would enable him to handle any situation that might develop. The bear moved slowly through the willows, occasionally rising up on its hind legs to test the air with its sensitive nose before dropping back down and continuing its foraging activities among the lush vegetation along the creek. From Jake's elevated position, the animal appeared massive, much larger than the black bears he had occasionally seen at distant ranges during previous mountain runs, though perspective and adrenaline may have contributed to his impression of the bear's size. More concerning was the discovery that the animal was not alone, as two much smaller shapes became visible moving through the vegetation nearby, cubs that couldn't be more than a few months old based on their size and playful behavior. The presence of cubs transformed the situation from an interesting wildlife observation opportunity into a potentially life-threatening encounter, as female bears with young are among the most dangerous animals in North America when they perceive threats to their offspring. Jake's limited knowledge of bear behavior included awareness that mother bears could become aggressive with little provocation, but he underestimated both the speed with which such encounters could escalate and the distance from which a female bear might perceive a human as threatening to her cubs. His position on the hillside above the bear family probably appeared threatening from the animal's perspective, despite Jake's belief that it was maintaining a safe distance and remaining concealed among the rocks and vegetation of the steep slope. The third and final warning came when the female bear suddenly stopped her foraging activities and stood motionless among the willows, her massive head turned directly toward Jake's position as if she had pinpointed his exact location despite his efforts to remain hidden. For several long seconds, human and bear stared at each other across the 100 yards of steep terrain that separated them, Jake frozen in place by the intensity of the animal's gaze, while the bear assessed the potential threat posed by his presence. Her cubs continued their playful exploration of the creek bottom, apparently unaware of the tension building between their mother and the human observer on the hillside above them. The bear's body language changed subtly but unmistakably from relaxed foraging posture to alert defensive stance, her ears pinned back against her skull and her shoulder muscles visibly tensing beneath her thick black coat. Jake realized that his presence had been detected, and that the situation was rapidly evolving beyond his ability to control. But his response was hampered by inexperience and poor decision-making under stress. Rather than immediately beginning a slow retreat that might have diffused the situation, he remained frozen in place, hoping that the bear would lose interest and resume her normal activities. This passive strategy proved disastrous as the female bear interpreted his continued presence as a persistent threat to her cubs and began moving up the slope toward his position, not yet charging but advancing steadily with the unmistakable intent of investigating or confronting the intruder in her territory. Jake's delayed recognition of the danger left him with limited options for escape, as the steep terrain that had seemed manageable during his ascent would be treacherous to descend rapidly under the stress of a bear encounter. His first few steps backward were cautious and controlled, but as the bear's advance continued relentlessly up the slope, panic began to override rational decision-making, and his retreat became increasingly hasty and uncontrolled. The combination of loose rock, steep terrain, and fear created perfect conditions for the accident that would transform a dangerous but manageable wildlife encounter into a life-or-death survival situation. Jake's left foot landed on a piece of granite that shifted under his weight, throwing him off balance at exactly the moment when his full attention was focused on the approaching bear rather than the treacherous footing beneath his feet. The fall began as a simple stumble but quickly escalated as his momentum carried him down the steep slope, his body bouncing and rolling over rocks and fallen logs, while the bear watched from above, probably as surprised by this development as Jake himself. The initial moments of Jake's fall seemed to occur in slow motion, his mind processing each impact and rotation with crystalline clarity while his body tumbled helplessly down the rocky slope toward the valley floor 30 feet below. His first contact with the ground drove the breath from his lungs and sent a sharp pain through his left shoulder. But momentum prevented him from regaining control, as loose rock and accumulated debris carried him further down the precipitous hillside. A fallen log caught him across the ribs with enough force to flip him completely over, and he felt, rather than heard, something crack in his chest cavity as his body absorbed the impact. His right ankle twisted beneath him as he tried to arrest his fall, sending lightning bolts of pain up his leg that made him cry out involuntarily, the sound echoing off the surrounding cliffs and announcing his distress to every creature within miles. The final impact came when his body struck a large boulder at the base of the slope, the collision violent enough to momentarily stun him and leave him lying motionless among the rocks while stars exploded across his vision and nausea washed over him in waves. For several minutes, Jake remained still, afraid to move and discover the full extent of his injuries, while his breathing gradually returned to normal and the worst of the pain subsided from acute agony to a steady throbbing that seemed to encompass his entire body. When he finally attempted to sit up, inventory of his condition revealed that while he had avoided any obviously life-threatening injuries, he was hurt badly enough that completing his planned training run was no longer possible. His right ankle was swollen and extremely painful to move, probably sprained but possibly fractured, making weight-bearing activities questionable at best. His left shoulder felt loose and unstable, suggesting a separation or dislocation that would limit his ability to use his arms for climbing or balance. Multiple lacerations on his hands and forearms wept blood onto his torn shirt, though none appeared deep enough to require immediate medical attention. More concerning was a growing headache and persistent dizziness that suggested a possible concussion from one of the impacts during his tumble down the slope. Jake's immediate priority was determining whether he could travel under his own power or whether he would need to signal for rescue from his current position, a decision that would prove academic given the continued presence of the bear family somewhere in the immediate vicinity. His hydration pack had survived the fall intact, ensuring that he had adequate water for an extended period, and his emergency supplies, including first aid materials, were undamaged and accessible. The GPS unit in his pack showed his exact coordinates, information that would be crucial for rescue efforts, though he had no way to communicate those coordinates to potential rescuers without cell phone coverage or emergency communication equipment. As the initial shock of the fall began to wear off, Jake became increasingly aware of his vulnerable position, lying injured at the bottom of a remote valley with no easy escape route and no immediate prospect of help arriving. The realization that his situation had deteriorated from challenging to potentially life-threatening came when Jake heard the same huffing and branch-breaking sounds that had alerted him to the bear's presence earlier, but now coming from much closer range as the family investigated the commotion caused by his fall. The female bear appeared first, emerging cautiously from the willows approximately 50 yards away, her massive form moving with surprising grace and stealth despite weighing nearly 300 pounds. Her cubs followed close behind, their playful demeanor replaced by the alert wariness they had learned from their mother when confronting unfamiliar situations or potential threats. Jake forced himself to remain absolutely still despite every instinct screaming at him to run, aware that sudden movements or attempts to flee would almost certainly trigger an aggressive response from the protective female. The bear family approached his position slowly and deliberately, stopping frequently to test the air with their sensitive noses and assess the strange situation they had discovered in their peaceful valley home. The female bear's behavior suggested curiosity rather than immediate aggression, but Jake understood that this could change instantly if she decided he posed a threat to her cubs or if his scent or movements triggered her defensive instincts. Minutes passed like hours as the bears continued their investigation, gradually working their way closer to Jake's position while he lay motionless among the rocks, trying to control his breathing and heart rate while preparing for whatever might happen next. The cubs seemed particularly interested in his brightly colored running gear, approaching within 20 feet before their mother's warning grunt sent them scurrying back to a safer distance. Jake's knowledge of bear behavior was insufficient to interpret the female's intentions, leaving him to rely on instinct and hope while she continued her careful evaluation of the situation. The standoff might have continued indefinitely with both human and bears maintaining their respective positions, but the delicate balance was disrupted when Jake's injured ankle shifted against a sharp rock, causing him to gasp involuntarily and tense his muscles in response to the sudden pain. The small sound and movement were enough to trigger the female bear's protective instincts, and her demeanor changed instantly from curious investigation to defensive aggression as she perceived Jake's reaction as a potential threat to her cubs. The female bear's charge began with a series of explosive huffs and jaw-popping sounds that Jake had read about but never expected to hear, vocalizations that serve as warnings in bear society, but often precede actual attacks when cubs are present. She covered the remaining distance between them in a matter of seconds, her powerful legs driving her 300-pound body forward with terrifying speed and agility across the uneven rocky terrain. Jake had no time to implement any of the bear safety protocols he had memorized from wilderness survival books. No opportunity to make himself appear large, back away slowly, or deploy the bear spray he hadn't bothered to carry. His injured condition made flight impossible and fighting futile, leaving him with only the option of assuming a protective position and hoping to survive whatever was about to happen. The bear reached his location and reared up on her hind legs, towering over his prone form, at a height that seemed impossible for any living creature he had ever encountered. Her massive claws extended and her mouth opened to reveal yellow teeth designed for tearing flesh and crushing bone. For a moment that lasted forever, Jake stared up into the bear's small dark eyes and saw an intelligence that was both alien and familiar, a fierce maternal protectiveness that transcended species boundaries while threatening to end his life in the most violent way imaginable. The first blow came from her right front paw, a swipe that was probably intended as a warning but caught Jake across his upper back and shoulder with enough force to drive him flat against the rocky ground. Her claws, each nearly 3 inches long and sharp as knives, raked through his shirt and into the muscle beneath, creating parallel furrows that immediately began bleeding profusely. The pain was beyond anything Jake had ever experienced, a burning, tearing sensation that seemed to encompass his entire upper body, while his nervous system struggled to process the overwhelming sensory input. The female bear dropped back to all fours and circled him slowly, her breathing heavy and audible as she assessed whether he posed any remaining threat to her family's safety. Jake forced himself to remain motionless, despite the fire spreading across his back and shoulders, aware that any movement might provoke additional attacks while hoping desperately that his passivity would satisfy the bear's defensive instincts and allow him to survive the encounter. The bear's second attack came when one of her cubs approached Jake's motionless form too closely, curious about the strange creature that had invaded their valley home. The female's maternal instincts overrode any assessment of Jake's threat level, and she struck again, this time targeting his exposed left arm with a precision that suggested experience in dealing with threats to her offspring. Her teeth closed around his forearm just below the elbow, the massive pressure crushing muscle and scraping bone while Jake screamed involuntarily, the sound echoing off the canyon walls and sending every other animal in the area fleeing to safety. The bear's grip lasted only seconds before she released him and backed away, but the damage was catastrophic, leaving puncture wounds that penetrated completely through his arm and severed several of the tendons controlling his hand and fingers. Blood flowed freely from the wounds, soaking into his torn shirt and pooling on the rocks beneath him, while Jake struggled to remain conscious despite the shock and blood loss. The female bear seemed satisfied with her defensive display and began moving her cubs away from the perceived threat, but she did not leave the area entirely, instead establishing a position on the far side of the valley where she could monitor Jake's activities while keeping her offspring at a safe distance. This behavioral choice would prove crucial to Jake's survival prospects, as the bear's continued presence would prevent him from attempting to leave the valley even if his injuries allowed movement, while her protective vigilance would also deter other predators that might be attracted by the scent of blood. Jake found himself trapped in a bizarre standoff where his tormentor had become his unwitting protector, keeping him confined in the remote valley while simultaneously ensuring that nothing else could approach to finish what she had started. The irony of the situation would have been amusing under different circumstances, but Jake's immediate concerns focused on more practical matters, including controlling his bleeding, treating his wounds, and somehow signaling for help from a location with no cell coverage and no reasonable expectation that searchers would think to look for him. Hours passed in a haze of pain and intermittent consciousness as Jake struggled to assess his injuries and implement basics, first aid measures with his remaining functional limbs. The wounds on his back had stopped bleeding significantly, though movement caused them to reopen and seep fresh blood onto his shredded shirt. His left arm presented a more serious problem, with puncture wounds that continued to bleed despite his efforts to apply pressure and elevate the injured limb. The damage to his hand and fingers made fine motor control nearly impossible, complicating his attempts to treat his own wounds or access the emergency supplies in his backpack. Most concerning was his growing awareness that shock and blood loss were affecting his mental clarity, making decision-making increasingly difficult just when clear thinking was most crucial for his survival. The female bear and her cubs had settled into a routine of feeding and resting across the valley, but they showed no inclination to abandon the area or lose interest in monitoring his activities. Any movement on Jake's part immediately attracted the female's attention, her massive head turning toward him with the focused intensity of a predator evaluating potential threats. This constant surveillance made it impossible for Jake to attempt any significant movement or to signal for help using his whistle or emergency strobe light, as such activities would almost certainly be interpreted as aggressive behavior requiring another defensive response. The temperature in the valley began dropping as afternoon shadows lengthened, reminding Jake that high-altitude nights in Colorado can be lethally cold even during late spring. His torn and bloody clothing provided minimal insulation, and his inability to move around to generate body heat meant that hypothermia would become an increasing threat as darkness approached. The emergency space blanket in his pack could provide some protection against heat loss, but accessing it would require movements that might provoke the bears, creating a deadly dilemma between immediate safety and long-term survival. Jake's water supply remained adequate for the present, but he was unable to eat anything from his emergency food stores due to nausea and the difficulty of chewing and swallowing with his injured jaw and concussion symptoms. The combination of blood loss, pain, and stress was taking a mounting toll on his physical reserves, leaving him weaker and less capable of dealing with the challenges ahead with each passing hour. As afternoon faded toward evening, Jake became increasingly aware that his survival would depend not just on treating his injuries and staying warm, but on somehow communicating his location to the outside world before his condition deteriorated beyond the point of recovery. His planned return time was still more than 24 hours away, meaning that even under the best circumstances, rescue efforts would not begin for another day, and searchers would have no reason to look for him in the remote valley where he now lay trapped. The email he had sent to Rick Hendricks contained his planned route, but the description was general enough that search teams would need to cover dozens of square miles of difficult terrain before reaching his actual location. Jake's GPS unit could provide precise coordinates to rescuers, but only if he could somehow transmit that information, and the remote location made cell phone communication impossible, even if his phone had survived the fall undamaged. His emergency whistle was useful for signaling at close range, but would not carry beyond the immediate valley, particularly with the noise-dampening effect of the dense forest surrounding his position. The strobe light in his survival kit offered better long-distance signaling capability, but only if potential rescuers were in the area and looking for him, conditions that were unlikely to be met before searchers had some reason to focus on his specific location. Jake's best hope lay in the possibility that his absence would be noticed earlier than expected, perhaps by co-workers who might try to reach him when he failed to appear for Monday morning meetings, or by his running partners who knew his habits well enough to recognize that missing a planned workout was uncharacteristic behavior that warranted investigation. These scenarios required considerable luck and timing to result in early deployment of search teams, but they represented his only realistic hope for rescue before exposure and blood loss rendered him incapable of surviving even the best emergency medical care. Meanwhile, the Bear family continued their normal activities with apparent indifference to Jake's deteriorating condition, the female maintaining her vigilant watch while the cubs played and explored their valley home under her protective supervision. The Bears' behavior suggested that they no longer viewed Jake as an immediate threat, but their continued presence ensured that he remained trapped in his current position with no opportunity to improve his situation through his own efforts. The long night that followed tested every aspect of Jake's physical and mental endurance as temperatures dropped into the 40s, and his injured body struggled to maintain core temperature without the benefit of movement or adequate insulation. The emergency space blanket provided some protection against radiant heat loss, but the thin metallic material offered no cushioning against the rocky ground and little defense against the cold mountain air that seemed to seep through every gap in his improvised shelter. Pain from his injuries made sleep impossible, leaving him to endure each hour of darkness in full awareness of his deteriorating condition and shrinking chances for survival. The female bear and her cubs had denned up somewhere in the thick vegetation across the valley, their presence marked by occasional sounds of movement and the cubs' quiet vocalizations, but Jake could not see them in the darkness and had no way of knowing whether they were sleeping or maintaining their watch over his position. Every sound in the night forest took on ominous significance as Jake's imagination conjured threats ranging from other predators attracted by the scent of blood to the possibility that the Bear family might return to investigate him more closely under cover of darkness. His water consumption increased as his body fought shock and blood loss, but rationing became necessary, as he realized that his 3-liter supply would not last more than 2 days under current conditions, and contaminated water from the creek would only add digestive problems to his already serious medical issues. The GPS unit continued to function normally, providing precise coordinates that would be invaluable to rescuers if he could somehow communicate his position, but the device's battery life was limited, and its illuminated screen made him feel vulnerable and exposed in the dark wilderness. Jake experimented with signaling using his emergency strobe light, activating it for brief periods while watching for any response from aircraft or ground-based searchers, but the deep valley location made it unlikely that his signals could be seen from any significant distance even under ideal conditions. As dawn finally approached, Jake's assessment of his situation had grown increasingly pessimistic, with his physical condition clearly deteriorating and no realistic prospect of rescue in the immediate future. Blood loss had left him weak and dizzy, while the combination of pain and exposure was affecting his mental clarity and decision-making abilities. Most concerning was his growing awareness that another night under current conditions would probably be beyond his capacity to survive, creating urgent pressure to somehow improve his situation before darkness returned. The second day of Jake's ordeal began with the discovery that his situation had somehow managed to become even worse during the night, as movement of his injured arm revealed that infection was already beginning to develop in the puncture wounds despite his efforts to keep them clean and covered. The distinctive smell and appearance of the drainage from his wounds suggested bacterial contamination, probably introduced by bacteria in the bear's mouth during the attack. and Jake's limited medical knowledge was sufficient to recognize that serious infection in a wilderness setting was often a death sentence, even for victims who survived their initial injuries. His first aid supplies included antibiotic ointment and oral pain medications, but nothing approaching the aggressive antibiotic therapy that would be required to combat a systemic infection originating from such contaminated wounds. The female bear and her cubs emerged from their overnight shelter as the sun climbed high enough to warm the valley floor, resuming their normal foraging activities while maintaining their surveillance of Jake's position. Their routine suggested that they had claimed the valley as territory and had no intention of moving on in the immediate future, dashing any hopes Jake might have harbored that they would eventually lose interest and allow him to attempt self-rescue. The cubs appeared larger and more active than they had the previous day, their playful behavior providing a surreal contrast to the life-and-death struggle playing out nearby, while their mother remained as vigilant and protective as ever, despite Jake's obvious weakness and inability to pose any realistic threat to her offspring. Jake's attempts to move even short distances to relieve pressure on his injured limbs immediately attracted the female's attention and warning vocalizations, making it clear that she would tolerate no significant changes in his position or behavior. This constraint forced him to remain in an increasingly uncomfortable position on the rocky ground, contributing to circulation problems and pressure sores that added to his overall misery while serving no protective purpose since he was clearly incapable of threatening the bear family in his current condition. The irony of being protected from other predators by the same animal that had nearly killed him was not lost on Jake, but his sense of humor was rapidly being overwhelmed by the grim reality that his protector was also his jailer, preventing any possibility of self-rescue while ensuring that he would die slowly from infection and exposure rather than quickly from additional predator attacks. The sound of aircraft engines sometime during the late morning hours sent Jake's heart racing with hope that search efforts were already underway. But the helicopter that appeared briefly above the canyon rim was too high and moving too fast to spot a single person lying among the rocks on the valley floor. Jake managed to activate his emergency strobe light and wave his functional arm, but the aircraft disappeared beyond the ridge before he could determine whether his signals had been observed, leaving him to wonder whether the flight was related to a situation or simply routine air traffic unconnected to any search efforts. The incident reminded him that even if search teams were deployed, finding him in such remote and difficult terrain would require considerable time and luck, particularly since the bear's presence would not be apparent to aerial observers, and searchers would have no reason to expect that wildlife encounters had complicated his situation. His email to Rick Hendricks had outlined his planned route in general terms, but had not included the specific coordinates of every location he intended to visit, meaning that search efforts would necessarily cover a large area with many potential locations where he might have encountered problems. The remote valley where he lay trapped was not on any established trail system and was not marked on most hiking maps, making it an unlikely priority for initial search efforts, which would logically focus on the more popular and accessible areas described in his route plan. Jake's engineering background made him acutely aware of the search theory and resource allocation challenges facing any rescue effort, knowledge that was both helpful for understanding why rescue was taking so long and depressing for its implications regarding his ultimate chances for survival. Professional search and rescue operations followed established protocols that prioritized high-probability areas based on statistical analysis of previous incidents, meaning that remote valleys like his current location would not be searched until more obvious possibilities had been eliminated, a process that could take days or weeks depending on available resources and weather conditions. The realization that he might need to survive for an extended period before rescue arrived forced Jake to begin thinking more systematically about resource management and survival priorities, though his weakened condition and limited supplies offered few opportunities for improving his long-term prospects through his own efforts. By afternoon of the second day, Jake's condition had deteriorated enough that he was having difficulty maintaining consciousness for extended periods, drifting in and out of awareness while his body struggled to cope with infection, blood loss, and exposure. During his lucid moments, he attempted to conserve his remaining water supply and monitor the bear family's activities, but increasingly he found himself disoriented and confused, unable to remember how long he had been in the valley or even how he had come to be in his current predicament. The infection in his arm was spreading visibly, with red streaks extending up toward his shoulder and lymph nodes in his armpits swollen and tender to touch. Classic signs of serious bacterial invasion that would require immediate hospital treatment to prevent systemic sepsis and organ failure. His core temperature seemed to fluctuate wildly between chills that left him shaking uncontrollably and fever episodes that made him feel overheated despite the cool mountain air, symptoms that suggested his body's immune system was losing its battle against the infection. Most alarming was his growing difficulty with basic cognitive functions, including determining the time of day, remembering his location coordinates, and calculating how long his water supply might last under current consumption rates. Mental impairments that indicated his brain was not receiving adequate oxygen and nutrients due to his compromised circulatory system. The female bear seemed to sense his deteriorating condition and became less vigilant about monitoring his every movement, though she still reacted to any significant activity with alert attention and warning vocalizations. Her cubs continued their normal development activities, including play fighting and foraging practice, behaviors that would be charming under different circumstances but now served as constant reminders of the maternal protectiveness that had created Jake's current predicament. The afternoon sun provided welcome warmth that temporarily improved Jake's comfort level, but he was increasingly aware that another night of exposure would probably be beyond his capacity to survive given his weakened state and inadequate shelter. His emergency supplies had proved insufficient for extended wilderness survival under adverse conditions, a planning failure that reflected his focus on completing his intended workout rather than preparing for worst-case scenarios that could require days of self-reliance in harsh conditions. The helicopter that had passed over earlier in the day returned during the late afternoon hours, this time flying a more systematic search pattern that suggested organized rescue efforts rather than routine air traffic. Jake summoned his remaining energy to signal with his strobe light and attempt to wave his functional arm, but the aircraft remained too high and distant to spot his position among the rocks and vegetation of the valley floor. Through the haze of fever and exhaustion, he could hear the helicopter making multiple passes over the surrounding area, each circuit raising his hopes that he might be spotted before darkness fell, and search efforts were suspended until morning. The sound of the aircraft also seemed to agitate the bear family, with the female rising repeatedly to her hind legs to investigate the noise, while her cubs sought shelter under her massive form, their normal confidence replaced by nervous alertness in response to the unfamiliar aerial intrusion. Jake realized that the bear's presence might actually help signal his location if the helicopter crew spotted them, and recognized that bears often remain in areas where carrion or food sources are available, potentially leading searchers to investigate the valley more thoroughly than they might otherwise consider necessary. This possibility provided a slim hope that his tormentors might inadvertently become his salvation, though the irony was probably too subtle to appreciate in his current condition of delirium and approaching system failure. The helicopter eventually departed without any sign that its crew had detected his presence, leaving Jake to face the prospect of another night alone in the wilderness, while his medical condition continued to deteriorate beyond the point where even immediate rescue might be sufficient to save his life. His water supply was nearly exhausted, his wounds were showing clear signs of advancing infection, and his core temperature regulation was failing despite his efforts to maintain warmth using his emergency blanket and the limited shelter provided by the rocky terrain around his position. Morning brought a new helicopter to the area, flying lower and following a more systematic grid pattern that convinced Jake that organized search efforts were now underway in his vicinity, though he remained weak and disoriented from his third night of exposure to the elements. This aircraft appeared to be specifically equipped for search operations, with external equipment that might include cameras or thermal imaging systems capable of detecting a human heat signature even among rocks and vegetation. Jake's efforts to signal were limited by his deteriorating physical condition, but he managed to activate his strobe light and move his emergency blanket in patterns that might catch the attention of trained observers, while hoping desperately that the search crew would spot either him or the bear family and investigate the valley more thoroughly. The female bear's reaction to the aircraft was more pronounced than previously, with aggressive vocalizations and posturing that suggested she viewed the helicopter as a threat to her cubs, behavior that ironically made the bear family more visible to potential rescuers than Jake himself in his camouflage position among the rocks. After what seemed like hours of systematic searching, the helicopter suddenly changed its flight pattern and began circling directly overhead, a development that sent Jake's heart racing with hope even as he struggled to remain conscious, long enough to take advantage of the opportunity. Through the noise of rotor wash and engine sounds, he could hear human voices on loudspeakers, though his confused mental state made it difficult to understand their communications or respond appropriately to their instructions. The sight of rescue equipment being deployed from the aircraft confirmed that his ordeal was finally approaching its end, though he retained enough awareness to realize that his medical condition was now so serious that survival would depend on the speed and quality of emergency treatment he received, rather than simply being found by search teams. The female bear's response to the helicopter activity was to move her cubs to a more protected position deeper in the valley, but she continued to monitor the situation with obvious agitation while the rescue operation developed overhead, creating a complex tactical problem for the flight crew, who now had to extract an injured victim while managing the presence of a large predator in the immediate area. The rescue operation that unfolded over the next several hours represented a carefully choreographed dance between human technology and wild animal behavior, as the helicopter crew worked to extract Jake from his precarious position while avoiding any actions that might provoke an attack from the protective female bear. Initial attempts to lower a rescue specialist to Jake's location were abandoned when the bear showed signs of aggressive intent toward the human descending into her territory, forcing the rescue team to develop alternative strategies that would allow them to reach their patient without triggering a potentially fatal confrontation. The solution involved using the helicopter's noise and rotor wash to encourage the bear family to move to a safer distance, while simultaneously deploying a rescue basket on a long line that could reach Jake's position without requiring human rescuers to enter the bear's defensive perimeter. Communication with Jake proved difficult due to his altered mental state and the noise of the helicopter, but rescue personnel were able to determine that he was conscious and able to follow simple instructions for getting himself positioned in the rescue basket. The extraction itself took nearly an hour as the helicopter crew maneuvered their aircraft with precision to avoid both the steep canyon walls and the unpredictable movements of the agitated bears, while Jake's weakened condition made it difficult for him to secure himself properly in the rescue equipment. Throughout the operation, the female bear maintained her vigil from a distance of approximately 50 yards, her massive form clearly visible to the rescue crew as she monitored their activities with obvious concern for her cubs' safety, creating additional stress for the flight team, who were well aware of the potential for disaster if their presence triggered an aggressive response. The moment when Jake was finally lifted clear of the valley floor marked the end of his 3-day ordeal, but the beginning of an intensive medical treatment process that would determine whether his rescue had come in time to save his life or merely provided an opportunity to receive palliative care in more comfortable surroundings. The helicopter flight to the nearest trauma center became a race against time as medical personnel worked to stabilize Jake's condition while racing across the Colorado mountains toward definitive medical care. Initial assessment revealed extensive soft tissue damage to his back and shoulder from the bear's claws, requiring immediate surgical intervention to clean and repair the lacerations, while removing debris and necrotic tissue that could complicate healing. The puncture wounds in his left arm showed clear signs of serious infection that had progressed to early sepsis, threatening multiple organ systems and requiring aggressive antibiotic therapy, along with surgical exploration to remove damaged tissue and establish drainage for continued wound care. Blood loss from his injuries, combined with dehydration and exposure, had left Jake's circulatory system severely compromised, necessitating multiple intravenous lines for fluid resuscitation and blood transfusions to restore adequate oxygen carrying capacity. His fractured ribs, sustained during the fall that had initiated his encounter with the bears, had not displaced enough to threaten his lungs but would require careful monitoring and pain management during his recovery period. Most concerning to the medical team was evidence of early kidney dysfunction, suggesting that infection and dehydration were beginning to affect his major organ systems in ways that could have permanent consequences even if his immediate survival was assured. Through prompt treatment, the flight to Denver's Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital Trauma Center required 45 minutes, during which Jake drifted in and out of consciousness while paramedics worked to maintain his vital signs and prepare him for the extensive surgical procedures that would be required immediately upon arrival. His vital signs remained tenuous throughout the flight, with blood pressure requiring constant pharmacological support and heart rhythm, showing irregularities that suggested significant physiological stress from his ordeal in the wilderness. The trauma team waiting at the hospital had been briefed on his condition during the flight, allowing them to prepare operating rooms and assemble the multidisciplinary team of specialists who would be required to address his complex array of injuries and medical complications. The surgical procedures required to repair Jake's injuries extended over 2 separate operations during his first 24 hours in the hospital, beginning with immediate exploration and cleaning of his infected wounds under general anesthesia. The bear's teeth had created puncture wounds that extended completely through his left forearm, damaging muscle, tendon, and nerve structures that would require careful repair to restore normal function to his hand and fingers. Contamination from bacteria in the bear's mouth had created extensive tissue death around the wound margins, necessitating aggressive surgical debridement that removed significant amounts of damaged tissue while preserving as much functional anatomy as possible. The claw marks across his back and shoulder required similar treatment, with multiple lacerations extending through skin and subcutaneous tissue into the underlying muscle layers, each requiring individual attention to remove debris and establish proper wound drainage. During the second surgical procedure, orthopedic specialists addressed his ankle fracture and explored the extent of ligament damage that had occurred during his fall down the rocky slope, discovering more extensive injury than initial X-rays had suggested and requiring surgical reconstruction to restore stability to the joint. Throughout both operations, Jake required intensive hemodynamic support to maintain adequate blood pressure and organ perfusion, with his body's response to surgery complicated by the systemic infection that had developed during his time in the wilderness. Post-operative care focused on aggressive antibiotic therapy to combat the polymicrobial infection typical of animal bite wounds, along with careful monitoring of his kidney and liver function as his body processed the metabolic load imposed by severe trauma and systemic illness. The infection in his arm responded slowly to treatment, requiring multiple return trips to the operating room for additional wound cleaning and tissue removal as the extent of bacterial contamination became apparent through laboratory studies and clinical observation. Pain management became a significant challenge as Jake's injuries involved multiple anatomical regions and surgical sites, while his history of athletic training meant that his pain tolerance was higher than average, making it difficult for medical staff to assess his comfort level and adjust medications appropriately. The long-term recovery process that followed Jake's initial stabilization and surgical treatment revealed the full extent of how the bear attack would permanently alter his life and athletic ambitions. Physical therapy began while he was still hospitalized, focusing initially on maintaining range of motion in his injured limbs and gradually progressing to strength and coordination exercises as his wounds healed and his overall medical condition improved. The nerve damage in his left arm proved more extensive than initially apparent, with persistent numbness and weakness in his hand that would require months of specialized rehabilitation and might never return to completely normal function. His ankle fracture healed with slight residual stiffness that affected his running gait, while the muscle damage in his back created ongoing problems with posture and shoulder stability that would require long-term attention from physical therapists and exercise specialists. Perhaps more challenging than the physical limitations were the psychological effects of his trauma, including persistent nightmares about bears and anxiety attacks when spending time in outdoor environments that had previously been sources of joy and relaxation. Jake's identity as a serious athlete was fundamentally shaken by his inability to return to his previous training intensity, with even short jogs causing discomfort in his injured ankle and shoulder, while longer runs remained impossible for months after the attack. The social dynamics within his running group were also affected, with some members treating him as a hero who had survived an extraordinary ordeal, while others seemed to view his experience as evidence of poor judgment that had unnecessarily exposed him to avoidable risks. His relationship with risk assessment and wilderness travel was permanently altered, with activities that he had previously undertaken without significant thought, now requiring extensive planning and safety precautions that sometimes made them less enjoyable than they had been before his encounter with the bear family. Professional counseling helped him process the trauma and develop coping strategies for managing his anxiety about outdoor activities. But the carefree confidence he had once brought to mountain running was gone forever, replaced by a more cautious and analytical approach that prioritized safety over adventure or athletic achievement. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding Jake's attack involved multiple agencies, including Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the Forest Service, and local search and rescue organizations, all seeking to understand how the encounter had occurred and what lessons could be learned to prevent similar incidents in the future. Wildlife biologists who examined the attack site confirmed that the valley had been used as a denning area by the female bear and her cubs, with evidence of their presence dating back several weeks before Jake's arrival in the area. The bear's behavior during the encounter was consistent with defensive aggression typical of female bears protecting their young, rather than predatory behavior that might suggest a more dangerous animal requiring lethal management. Her decision to remain in the area rather than fleeing after the initial confrontation was also normal maternal behavior, as female bears with cubs often establish defensive positions around perceived threats rather than retreating and potentially exposing their offspring to danger during movement. The cubs appeared healthy and well-developed based on observations during the rescue operation, suggesting that their mother was successfully raising them despite the stress of the human encounter and subsequent helicopter activity in their territory. DNA analysis of Jake's wounds confirmed that all injuries were inflicted by the same individual bear, ruling out the possibility that multiple animals had been involved in the attack and supporting the conclusion that this was a defensive rather than predatory encounter. The female bear was tracked and monitored for several weeks following the incident but showed no signs of food conditioning or aggressive behavior toward humans beyond her defensive response to Jake's presence near her cubs. Wildlife managers ultimately decided not to relocate or destroy the bear, recognizing that her actions had been motivated by protection of her offspring rather than abnormal aggression, and that the remote location of the encounter made it unlikely that she would pose ongoing risks to human visitors. The decision reflected current wildlife management philosophy that emphasizes coexistence with large predators whenever possible, reserving lethal control measures for animals that demonstrate persistent aggressive behavior or food conditioning that makes them ongoing threats to human safety. The broader implications of Jake's experience extended beyond his personal recovery to influence wilderness safety education and bear management policies throughout Colorado and other western states with significant bear populations. His case was studied by wildlife biologists as an example of how early spring conditions can disrupt normal bear behavior patterns and increase the likelihood of human-bear encounters in areas where such incidents are historically rare. The early snowmelt that had drawn Jake to high-altitude training had also forced bears to expand their foraging ranges and seek denning sites at higher elevations than normal, creating overlap between human recreational activities and bear family territories that might otherwise remain separate. Safety educators used Jake's experience to emphasize the importance of carrying bear spray even in areas where bear encounters are considered unlikely, noting that his decision to leave deterrent equipment behind had eliminated his only realistic option for ending the confrontation before it escalated to physical contact. The incident also highlighted the challenges facing search and rescue operations in remote wilderness areas, where even extensive search efforts may take days to reach victims and where complex factors like wildlife presence can complicate rescue operations significantly. Emergency communication technology became a more prominent focus of wilderness safety education, with Jake's inability to summon help serving as a reminder that cell phone coverage remains unreliable in many popular outdoor recreation areas, and that alternative communication methods may be necessary for activities in truly remote locations. His experience influenced recommendations for emergency equipment carried by solo travelers in bear country, with updated guidelines emphasizing not just bear deterrence and first aid supplies, but also signaling devices and emergency shelters capable of protecting injured individuals during extended waits for rescue. The psychological aspects of wildlife encounter trauma also received increased attention from outdoor recreation organizations, with Jake's struggles during recovery highlighting the need for comprehensive support services that address both physical and emotional consequences of traumatic wilderness experiences. As we reflect on Jake Morrison's harrowing encounter with a protective mother bear in the remote wilderness of Colorado's Front Range, several critical questions emerge that every outdoor enthusiast should consider before venturing into bear country. How might this terrifying ordeal have unfolded differently if Jake had made the simple decision to carry bear spray during his mountain training run, And does this case demonstrate that even experienced outdoor athletes can fall victim to overconfidence when assessing wildlife risks in familiar terrain? What does Jake's 3-day survival ordeal teach us about the importance of emergency communication equipment and detailed itinerary sharing when pursuing solo activities in areas without cell phone coverage, particularly given that even extensive search operations may require days to locate missing persons in remote mountainous terrain? How should outdoor recreation policies and education programs address the changing patterns of wildlife behavior caused by climate factors like early snowmelt and unusual weather patterns that can disrupt traditional seasonal activity cycles for both humans and animals? Does Jake's experience suggest that current wilderness safety education adequately prepares recreational athletes for the complex decision-making required during actual wildlife encounters, or do most people rely too heavily on statistical arguments about low encounter probabilities rather than practical preparation for worst-case scenarios? These questions become particularly relevant as outdoor recreation continues to grow in popularity, while bear populations recover throughout much of their historical range, creating increased opportunities for encounters between humans and wildlife in areas where such interactions were previously rare. Jake's story serves as a powerful reminder that wilderness experiences can shift from routine athletic challenges to life-threatening survival situations with little warning, making preparation and situational awareness crucial elements of any outdoor adventure regardless of experience level or perceived risk. His physical recovery continues today, nearly 2 years after his encounter with the bear family. Though he has returned to running on familiar trails close to urban areas where emergency services remain accessible and wildlife encounters are less likely. The psychological healing has proven more challenging than the physical rehabilitation, with Jake still struggling to recapture the sense of freedom and confidence that once made mountain running his greatest passion. Though he remains grateful for the skilled rescue efforts and medical care that saved his life during his darkest hours in the Colorado wilderness. If this incredible story of survival against overwhelming odds has resonated with your own experiences in the outdoors or provided valuable insights into wilderness safety and bear encounter protocols, please share your thoughts in the comments below and help continue the conversation about how we can all enjoy our natural landscapes while respecting the powerful wildlife with whom we share these magnificent spaces. Make sure to subscribe for more incredible survival stories and wilderness safety content. And remember that the next time you head into bear country, the simple decision to carry proper safety equipment and inform others of your detailed plans could mean the difference between a memorable adventure and a fight for survival, like Jake's terrifying encounter in the high mountains of Colorado.